Chapter 368. Taking him by surprise, the stone pillars of the ancient and majestic palace supported the high dome. Klein sat at the end of the long bronze table, holding a translucent brown bottle. He checked it over and over again, but he didn't sense any danger from it. Let's begin. He conjured a pen and paper and wrote the divination statement, its origin. Putting the fountain pen away and bracing himself for a blow, Klein glanced at the paper and the biological poison bottle, leaned back in his chair, and entered cogitation while reciting the statement. Soon he entered a hazy gray dream world and saw a dark but spacious room. There were king cobras, black widows, and other strange plants and animals in the room. It was a messy and harrowing scene. A middle-aged man in a white coat was standing in front of a long table in the middle of the room. He threw the snake gall and spider venom into the huge black pot that hung from the ceiling. In the end, he even put in a few items that possessed a strong spiritual luster. For example, they would sometimes disperse into a black gas, and other times condense into dark green lung-shaped objects. Otherwise, they would be in the form of a tube containing a clear azure liquid or fiery red eyes. The air around the black iron pot gradually became viscous. It was gathering towards the center, but it was constantly being pushed aside, making it difficult to achieve its goal. When the white-robed middle-aged man saw this scene, his brow slowly creased, his expression looked slightly anxious. He flipped through the black notebook by his side, gritted his teeth, and used a ritual silver dagger to slice open his wrist. Drops of fresh blood dripped into the black iron pot, seemingly breathing life into its contents instantly. A terrifying suction force suddenly erupted, sucking in all the viscous air around it. The scarlet blood which had yet to leave his wrist was fully sucked into it. And that wasn't everything. Regardless of how the white-robed middle-aged man struggled to resist, or how he revealed a terrified expression, he couldn't prevent his body from approaching the iron pot. His body was stretched, his head was compressed, and amidst his screams, he was eaten little by the pot. The hanging specimens, plants, and anything that could move or be moved all flew into the pot. Brown fog suddenly filled the room, quietly ebbing and flowing. By the time it was all over, the room was empty except for the brown, translucent bottle lying quietly in the middle of the clearing. The scene quickly faded away, and the dream world shattered. Klein opened his eyes and muttered to himself, "So the biological poison bottle is a product of a death-seeking experiment. I thought it was a beyonder characteristic left behind by some beyonder. If that were the case, I'd have been able to divine a formula." To Klein, a rampager's spirituality and beyonder characteristic, as well as a spirituality and beyonder characteristic which was contaminated by an evil god, could all be used to divine a formula. Just like the all-black eye which Nimblewright Master Rosago left behind. It was thanks to the isolation effects of the gray fog, and how the mysterious space was able to eliminate negative influences, giving him the ability to court death. Of course, a beyonder characteristic involved many other additional factors. In theory, the chances of failure were extremely high, but Klein only had the confidence to do so after advancing to magician. Similarly, a sealed artifact formed by beyonder characteristics could also be used to divine the formula for a potion. However, if they were mainly ingredients, then through the production processes and dangerous experiments done by an artisan or other beyonders, turning them into mystical items, then Klein's divination would be useless at his current state. Even with the enhancement effect provided by the mysterious space above the gray fog, it was useless. Not bad. At least I don't have to worry about the biological poison bottle having any other latent risks anymore. Klein glanced at the werewolf Fong and wisely abandoned his curiosity. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall, Audrey continued her study of psychology. By her feet, the huge golden retriever, Susie, was sitting there, her eyes shining. From time to time, she wagged her tail as if enjoying the scene. Psychiatrist Escalante finished the introduction material and deliberately made a casual remark. Actually, there is such a theory. It's believed that humans would inherit a certain amount of their ancestors' consciousness over the generations, thus forming the underlying logic of one's behavior patterns. For example, although many people have never seen a poisonous snake, They would instinctively feel afraid and wish to avoid it once they encounter one. Why is that? This is theorized to be an instinct that we inherited from our ancestors, something that is hidden in the deepest recesses of our consciousness. In ancient times, people constantly fought with poisonous snakes and all kinds of ferocious animals, and they gradually carved this memory into their consciousness and passed it down. How does it get passed down? Audrey asked with interest. Escalante, with her long hair which reached her waist, laughed. That's a very good question. Some people provide explanations that involve a theory that everyone's consciousness is actually connected at the lowest level. It is one entity, and the traces and characteristics left behind on this entity will affect the consciousness that belongs solely to them. For example, the lowest level of consciousness is like an endless ocean. Our unique consciousness would be the islands situated in the ocean and can be split into two parts. One is hidden under the water, which is the subconscious, which is higher in both quantity and size. The other is exposed on the surface of the ocean, the superficial consciousness that can usually be detected. This is the axiom of this school of thought in psychology. Audrey glanced at Susie, stroked the golden fur on its neck and said, "So, we can use this connected ocean to influence the consciousness of others and achieve the goal of curing certain mental illnesses? This is the mysticism foundation and beyonder powers of a psychiatrist? But it doesn't seem enough and is lacking something. For example, the sky above one's head, the sky which shrouds everything?" Audrey curiously thought as she wore a look of confused enlightenment. "You're really talented in this area." Escalante praised in delight. "However, we can only affect a portion of the surrounding ocean, and through it we can affect those who are close to us. If we venture deeper into the ocean, it will be easy for us to lose ourselves." She looked up at the ornate and complicated clock on the wall, smiled, and said, "Time's up. This is the end of today's class. Miss Audrey, if you're interested in this psychological school of thought, then we can continue talking about it next time." "All right." Audrey stood up and bowed. Watching Escalante leave, she nodded in thought. Ma'am Escalante doesn't seem like a real psychiatrist. At most, she's like me, a telepathist. Was what she just talked about the axioms of the psychology alchemists? They really are patient. Why aren't they trying to recruit me yet? As Audrey was in thought, Susie commented happily from the side, "Audrey, I feel like she's the same type of person as us." "No, I mean the same type of dog." "No, that's not right." Susie, who only had a rudimentary grasp of the human language, fell into a state of confusion, unable to find the right words to describe her feelings. South of the bridge, Rose Street, outside the Harvest Church. Klein, in his normal disguise, looked up at the sacred emblem of life on the facade, held his cane, climbed the steps, and stepped through the main door. The first thing he had to do was to confirm the situation. Only by doing this could he perform better so as to ingeniously rescue the vampire, Emlyn White, without garnering suspicion. Then, as a detective who had provided clues, he could receive the gratitude from the White family and gain the applause of an audience. It was bound to be an interesting performance. The Harvest Church wasn't big, as it only had a prayer hall. Klein found a spot by the aisle and looked ahead as he took off his hat. Bishop Utravsky was preaching. His height of more than 2 meters, and his burly physique, which couldn't be concealed by his loose priest robes, gave off an extreme sense of oppression. However, his expression was one of extreme gentleness, filled with appreciation and gratitude towards life. In front of such a priest, no one dared to cause a ruckus. The few believers quietly listened, occasionally making prayer gestures unique to the Church of Mother Earth. Klein watched carefully, waiting patiently, neither conceited nor rash. As the sermon ended, he gripped his cane and prepared to get up to proceed with his subsequent plans. At this moment, a man wearing the priest robes of the Church of Mother Earth entered from the door that led to the room at the back of the cathedral. He looked 28 or 29 years old, had black hair and red eyes, possessing a high nose and thin lips. He was handsome but didn't give off masculine vibes. He was none other than Emlyn White. Klein's mouth gaped a little and nearly failed to close it. Isn't this guy supposed to be locked up in the basement? Wasn't he shouting about how determined he was, That he would absolutely not submit to Bishop Yutravsky's will? Emlyn White distributed the communion to one believer after another, and he finally stopped in front of Klein. Klein's mind whirred, and he immediately in a low voice, "Are you Emlyn White? Your parents entrusted my friend to look for you. Why are you here? Did you encounter something? Are you in need of assistance?" Emlyn White didn't seem to have his unique pride and said with a smile that only looked slightly better than crying, "There's no need, I will be returning home soon." He pursed his lips, shook his head, and forced a smile, saying, "I am already a believer of Mother Earth, no, a priest." This answer was completely out of Klein's expectations. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond, and he could only shout repeatedly in his mind, "Hey, you were very adamant about your worship of the moon the last time we interacted at the Harvest Church. You said that you would absolutely not convert to believing in Mother Earth. How long has it been, and you have already given in? Isn't that way too fast? What about your persistence? Where's your moral integrity? My carefully prepared performance has been forced to end before it has even begun. If this is just taking me by surprise." Klein opened his mouth and suddenly realized something amiss. Why is Emlyn White informing me of his conversion? I'm just a detective who accidentally chanced upon him while passing by. Does he wish for me to pass this message to his parents? Is there another meaning behind this? While Klein was guessing, Emlyn White put away his worried and smiled smugly. "You don't have to act, Mr. Detective. Or should I call you the new owner of the master key? Hee. To a noble sanguine, everyone has a different smell and has different blood characteristics. Even when I was locked up in the basement, I could smell it. I remember your smell." Chapter 369. Inception. I've been recognized. Klein instantly fell into shock as he nearly entered combat mode. Even if he didn't use his spirit vision, he could tell from Emlyn White's tone and words that he wasn't lying. He was very confident and certain. Just as the tense feelings rose in him, Klein suddenly thought of something. Why should I worry about that? Then, he answered his own question in his mind, so what if I was recognized? The current situation is different from what it was 2 months ago. I was left flustered by the incident with Ambassador Bakerland in front of the official Beyonders. I was rushing around, trying to grasp at every possible straw. In the process, I ended up making contact with Beyonder circles, and even the possibility of me becoming a Beyonder was quite plausible. Therefore, even if my identity as a Beyonder was exposed, they wouldn't think too deeply about it and dig up my past. And it's very likely that Detective Isengard Stanton is a Beyonder, and he maintains good relations with the police and the official Beyonder organizations. He had speculated that I was the same as him and tried to gently rope me in. In this regard, I can barely be counted as a borderline member of the official Beyonders, and if anything were to happen, I wouldn't necessarily be imprisoned. More importantly, I have already made my current image so deeply ingrained that I don't have to worry about any wanted posters. If anything goes wrong, then I can just abandon 15 Minsk Street and my identity as Sherlock Moriarty. So, what's there to worry about? Yes, before I came here, I had also performed a divination, and the revelation was that there was almost no danger. As these thoughts flashed across his mind, Klein's contracted pupils, slightly appalled expression, and his fight or flight state eased, as if he was discussing the day's weather with Emlyn White. Seeing his calm expression, Emlyn White raised his eyebrows, took a few steps to the side, and squeezed past him before slowly sitting to his side. The vampire looked at Bishop Yutravsky, who was leading the believers in the rite of Holy Communion, and he said with a sneer, "Mr. Detective, aren't you afraid that I'll go to the police station and shout out loud that you're a Beyonder?" Similarly, Klein looked forward and said without turning his head, "I'll go with you and shout out loud that there's a vampire. Come on, let's have an internecine outcome. Do you think I'm afraid of you?" Emlyn White's expression stiffened. He raised his right index finger and said, "Sanguine, a noble sanguine. Got it?" Before Klein could speak, seeing that Bishop Yutravsky was preoccupied with the rites of Holy Communion, Emlyn White chuckled and said, "Regardless, I'm finally going to be free. I pretended to submit and told the old man that I was willing to convert to believing in Mother Earth and was deeply penitent for what I had done." Although I have no idea what was necessary to show repentance, it's not a problem to put on an act. That old man actually believed me like this, and he was very happy as well. He let me out on the spot, and he let me become a priest here. He told me that as long as I memorized the Holy Bible of the Church of Mother Earth, he would allow me to return home. Haha, that old fogey, who's all brawn and has become silly from his faith, sure is easy to fool. Easy to fool? Klein turned his head to look at the vampire. Looking smug, he looked forward and said, Father Yutravsky used to be a pirate. He probably killed far more people than the number of people your father has ever saved. Furthermore, most pirates don't trust their fellow crew members. Betrayal and trickery are common among them. To be a relatively successful pirate able to live to the end, Father Yutravsky wouldn't be a person who's easily fooled, even if he's not a bright person. Emlyn White wore a look of disbelief as he wished to retort. Klein rubbed the top of his cane and leisurely added, Father has a powerful sealed artifact in his possession. It is known as the mental terror candle. It can allow the wielder to enter the deepest recesses of the target soul. There, no one can lie. Moreover, this is only one of its uses. I don't know if it has any other abilities. Emlyn gradually froze, his eyes losing focus. After a dozen seconds, he whispered with a pale expression, When I said I was willing to change my faith, that old man came in with a lantern. There was a candle in the lantern, and I didn't get a good look at it. Klein tilted his head and gave Emlyn White a sympathetic glance. Perhaps Father Yutravsky used it to plant a seed in you, one that gradually and thoroughly makes you wholeheartedly believe in Mother Earth. The corner of Emlyn's mouth twitched, revealing a smile comparable to a zombie's. I don't feel anything at all. It shouldn't be anything like you said. Besides, aren't my parents coming? They can blame the priest through ordinary people, saying that he forcefully detained me, forcing him to make a choice between sullying the Church of Mother Earth's reputation and letting me go. Isn't that a great idea? Klein maintained his look of pity, clasped his hands, and raised them to his nose, acting truly penitent. If I were Father Yutravsky, I would choose to call the police and have them determine the truth. Tell me, who do you think will suffer in the end, the bishop who has the right to preach or a vampire? Sanguine. Emlyn White's facial muscles seemed to twitch. He clenched his fist and punched the back of the pew in front of him. I can wait. Once I memorize the Holy Bible, I will ask the old man to let me return. He is a truly devout person and will not break his promise. Klein didn't turn his head and said with a smile, I've been to 48 River Bay Avenue. Your parents have already moved away. Naturally. Not only will they move away, they will also move to somewhere I'm not aware of, Emlyn White responded without hesitation. Klein added with a relatively relaxed tone, they moved in a hurry. They left a lot of things behind, such as the things in your room. Emlyn White's expression suddenly became extremely wonderful. He gaped his mouth, abruptly stood up, squeezed past Klein, and rushed towards Bishop Yutravsky, who stood in front of the sacred emblem of life. Father, Bishop, I want to return home, I want to return home, I want to return home. Emlyn shouted. Seeing that there were still believers who hadn't finished their Holy Communion yet, Father Yutravsky didn't respond. He merely gave the pitiful vampire a calm look. Emlyn quickly shut his mouth and became quiet. He paced back and forth, looking extremely anxious. Smiling, Klein stood up, took his cane and hat, and strolled down the aisle to the front pew of the cathedral's hall. When Holy Communion was over, he walked up to Father Yutravsky and said with a serious expression, Bishop, I don't know why you're retaining Emlyn here, nor do I want to know. I only know one thing. His parents have entrusted me to take him back. If this giant-like priest agrees to my request so easily, I can only light a vigil candle for this vampire, Emlyn. No, I'm sure he will hate candles from this day forth. It's best to mourn for him, Klein secretly thought. Father Yutravsky looked down at them and replied gently, Emlyn can return home at any time. Klein gave Emlyn White a glance, raised his right hand, and tapped his chest. He wanted to gesture the sign of the crimson moon by tapping in a clockwise fashion, but in the end, he forced himself to draw the triangular sacred emblem. Emlyn became rather anxious from the look Klein gave him. Without a word, he rushed to the door of the cathedral and left without a hitch. Klein followed him at a moderate pace without any signs of anxiety. After proceeding forward in what appeared like a jog, Emlyn suddenly slowed down and said in a daze, "I feel like I'm starting to miss the Harvest Church, the feeling of memorizing the Holy Bible, and the sacred emblem of life. I wish to return to clean and tidy the place. It'll only take an hour. This planted seed is even more vicious than I had imagined. No matter where this vampire goes, he will return to the Harvest Church every day and work for an hour? That's actually quite all right. At the very least, the seed which was planted didn't change Emlyn's faith. In a way, he's showing him some respect, but why did I use the word respect? That candle is called Mental Terror Candle, and it's said to be from a dragon. The spectator pathway is rather scary." Klein tapped his cane and said, "Do you need me to remind you of anything?" "There's no need." Emlyn's expression distorted as he angrily said, "I will fight this feeling. I'm going to move to Midseashire or Faysac. I don't believe that I'd still wish to return when I've left Backland." He gritted his teeth and suddenly exhaled. "Let's take the carriage back to River Bay Avenue." "All right," Klein responded nonchalantly. After a few steps, Emlyn stopped a rental carriage. Just as he was about to board the carriage, his back stiffened for 2 seconds. Then, he said so quietly that Klein could barely hear him, "I don't have any money on me." "I do." Klein smiled. Emlyn stopped talking and got onto the carriage. Klein sat across him, and as the carriage began to move off, he asked as if in thought, "Your father is a doctor? One that possesses outstanding skills in drugs and medicine?" Although he was listless, Emlyn raised his chin out of habit. "This is the gift that we sanguine enjoy. The most outstanding potion masters are all from the sanguine." "Is that so?" Klein whispered to himself, his thoughts a mystery. Emlyn said after a moment of silence, "Write to your friend and tell him that I have returned to River Bay Avenue. My parents will come looking for me." "All right," Klein answered simply. After nearly 20 minutes, the carriage pulled into River Bay Avenue and stopped in front of Unit 48. After paying the fare, Klein got out of the carriage and saw Emlyn White look towards the bedroom, his expression becoming abnormally excited. Restraining himself, the vampire pressed his hand to his chest and bowed deeply at Klein. "In any case, I must thank you." Klein immediately revealed a smile. "There's no need to thank me. The bounty reward of finding you and the transportation fees will be obtained from your parents. Also, you have to concoct a medicine with beyonder effects to help me treat a patient. This is the reward that your family should pay." Chapter 370. The Audience's Applause. Bounty Reward, Transportation Fees, and Medicine with Beyonder Effects. Emlyn White was left momentarily dazed when he first heard that. This was not the answer that he had expected. "What about your gentlemanliness?" The vampire thought in shock. As a detective, abiding by clear accounting principles is necessary. Besides, you've even delayed my visit to the Quelad Club. I don't know what food they've offered in limited supply for the past 2 days. Klein looked at Emlyn White as he joked and lampooned silently. After a few seconds, Emlyn forced a smile and said, "I have to see the patient before I can concoct the appropriate medicine." "From your tone, you sound really confident." Klein nodded thoughtfully. He then thought of a problem. The White family seems to be a family of outstanding potion scholars. If I were to really be injured and poisoned, then I can come to them for treatment. Wouldn't all of my efforts of going out of my way to get the apothecary formula from Father Utravsky be for naught? I no longer need to nurture another aid that's good at healing. Reality sure does change faster than a plan. However, it's not really a waste either. I've already made back my investment from Miss Magician. For things like formulas, as long as it exists, it will always be valuable. Besides, the White family will definitely stay away from River Bay Avenue and live their lives with new secret identities. I might not be able to find them, so it's not that convenient. No, before the mental terror candle's inducing thoughts are resolved, all I need to do is wait for Emlyn White at the Harvest Church. With this in mind, Klein took off his hat, bowed and said, "No problem, I will take you there when the time comes. I shall not waste your time any further. Cheerio." Emlyn White's expression changed as he hesitantly said, "If you can remove the effect of the mental terror candle, then you will receive a greater bounty," and he paused and raised his chin. "And the friendship of the sanguine. I'm a magician, and I possess the sun brooch and biological poison bottle. I'm only limited to mediumship when it comes to the aspect of one's psyche, so what can I do? Amongst the people I know, only Miss Justice is a close match, but she's only a sequence 8 telepathist. Unless you change your faith to the fool that doesn't belong to this era, then we will be able to find out how to use the knowledge recorded in the Book of Secrets to help you solve this problem through a corresponding ritual. Speaking of which, vampires seem to be worshippers of the primitive moon, very similar to the Shaman King and the like. Could the ancient god recorded in the City of Silver, the vampire ancestor, Lilith, be the primitive moon?" Klein said with a smile as his thoughts wandered. "I'll keep a lookout for ways to help you." Emlyn White nodded and didn't say anything else. He impatiently turned around and rushed to the door. If it wasn't for the fact that the carriage driver was still nearby, he would have spread his black bat wings and soared directly to the second floor. Klein laughed and shook his head emotively. He rode back in the same rental carriage and arrived at the steam metro not far away. He then made a transfer and returned to Sherwood Borough's 15 Minsk Street. Before entering the room, Klein, who had become accustomed to opening the letterbox, checked for letters. To his surprise, there really was a letter. There was no stamp on the letter. It was addressed to Detective Sherlock Moriarty and was signed off with Jürgen Cooper. Lawyer Jürgen? Puzzled, Klein picked up the envelope and tore it open. Under the light of the street lamp, he saw a piece of paper and 2 bills. The denominations of these 2 notes were 1 soldi and 5 soldi. Total of 6 soldi. "I fed the cat 3 times during the period." The agreement was 2 soldi per instance. Realizing the reason, Klein opened the door and lit the gas lamp. As he unfolded the letter, he discovered that it didn't contain much, and the words that Jürgen had handwritten were as precise and serious as he was. "Dear Detective Moriarty, thank you for taking care of Brody over the past few days. This is the reward you deserve. I rang the doorbell twice and found that you weren't at home, so I could only put the payment in an envelope and put it in your letterbox. As I might not be able to come back until tomorrow evening, I might miss the verbal agreement which my grandmother promised, tonight. As a lawyer, I value the validity of verbal agreements and hope that they will be carried out strictly. Finally, thank you once again. Jürgen Cooper." "Mr. Lawyer, your gratitude is so dry and boring that it's even inferior to Brody's, but the explanation for your behavior is very detailed. It really fits the Jürgen style. Also, why place it in my mailbox? If this were Earth, in the time before I transmigrated, I might not even look at the mailbox downstairs for months." Klein smiled as he folded the bills and placed them in his pocket. Then he took out a sheet of paper and wrote to Detective Stewart. After writing the beginning pleasantries, he wrote after some deliberation. "I found Emlyn White at the Harvest Church near Tativa Street. It's a very small cathedral belonging to the Church of Mother Earth. It isn't very common in Lone. Emlyn White claimed that it was because of certain matters that he chose to run away from home. Afterwards, he was taken in by the bishop of the Harvest Church and stayed there, becoming a..." Klein thought for a moment before writing down the word volunteer. Then he added simply, "Thanks to my persuasion, he has returned to 48 River Bay Avenue. However, he might visit the Harvest Church often for volunteer work." When he was done, Klein read through it, then he put down the pen and neatly folded the letter. He rummaged around for an envelope, but he didn't affix the corresponding stamp. He planned to hire someone to deliver it directly to Stewart's house the next day. If he were to go through the kingdom's postal system, even if he were to put the letter in the mailbox now, he wouldn't be able to get it taken away by the postman until tomorrow, and then there would be the process of sorting and delivering it. So, although he was also in the royal capital of Backland, Stewart would have to wait at least until the day after next before seeing the letter. Only then would the Whites be notified. And during this period of time, Emlyn White was a penniless guy with only his figurines. This is also for the sake of receiving payment early. Klein chuckled, tidied up the coffee table, and returned to the second floor to brush his teeth and take a bath. On Wednesday morning, after spending 2 solely and entrusting a rental carriage driver to deliver the letter, Klein bought some of the main ingredients for Desi seafood rice, intending to cook fried rice today. He couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva when he thought of the pearly white rice. After spending some time, he finally cooked a pot of fragrant fried rice with bacon and black tea after going through all sorts of hassles in the kitchen. It was so delicious that tears almost filled his eyes. This is truly a moving and nostalgic taste. After eating 2 large plates of fried rice, Klein sat down on the chair and rubbed his belly. As Emlyn White's situation had too many twists and turns, his performance had already ended before it had even really begun, and he couldn't achieve the desired goal. Thus, he could only look for another opportunity to take the initiative for a performance. However, Klein still benefited from this. Failure was also an experience, and it made him understand at least one thing. Unlike ordinary magicians, my performance not only has aides, but it also has enemies and participants. Their reactions and choices can similarly affect its development. I have to consider all of these elements ahead of time. This is also a lesson. It's better to be taught a lesson over such a trivial matter than to be schooled when facing important matters. Klein looked at the empty plate in front of him and contemplated about what other performances he could initiate. After a moment of serious consideration, he realized that there weren't any. Of course, it wasn't absolute. They were just unsuitable for him to do them now. For example, Klein had always wanted to take care of that evil spirit in the 4th epic ruins of the Tudor dynasty. But even if it was Sharon, who had the scarlet lunar corona, and Marek, who had obtained the Rampager Beyonder characteristic of a wraith, Klein didn't think that they were able to fight against the high sequence monster. It was even possible to end up dead before even knowing why. Taking the initiative to perform isn't equivalent to courting death. It's not about using one's life to perform, Klein warned himself. There was something else he wanted to do, but he didn't think there was much of a chance. It was to find the strange child, Willa Septon, who had brought bad luck to the surgeon Aaron. Klein had always been interested in the tarot card which the child possessed, and he wanted to confirm if it was a mystical item. Unfortunately, this case had already been taken over by the Nighthawks, and Klein didn't want to get involved with his former colleagues. I'll wait for Dr. Aaron's break time before heading to the Quelag Club and asking about the progress, and then I'll decide what to do. Klein's thoughts quickly took shape. According to what he knew, Dr. Aaron was usually free on Friday afternoons and Sundays in which he would play tennis at the Quelag Club. Klein had also confirmed one thing through today's Backlund Morning Post. There would be a Beyonder gathering tomorrow night organized by Eye of Wisdom. I can't sell the werewolf Beyonder characteristic or the biological poison bottle for the time being. I can't even find someone to turn the former into a mystical item. The high-sequence Beyonders of the Rose School of Thought are definitely still active nearby, filled with rage. I bet they can't wait to find Sharon, Marek, and their helper before tearing them apart. He had to keep a low profile in this area for the time being. Klein picked up his napkin, wiped his mouth, and began to clear the table. He had wanted to rest for the day and go to the Quelag Club for a leisurely day without taking the initiative to perform, but then he recalled the Amon avatar which attempted to penetrate the gray fog, and he recalled the role that the Book of Secrets had played in that harrowing moment. So Klein lit the fireplace in the living room and brought the Book of Secrets back to the real world. He then concentrated on reading, studying, and taking notes. Of course, he would later burn the corresponding notes above the gray fog. It was already noon before he realized it when he suddenly heard the doorbell ring. After hiding the Book of Secrets, Klein entered the living room and went straight to the door. The visitor was the thin, bearded Detective Stewart. He looked at Klein with great reverence and excitement, and he couldn't wait to praise him. You really are a great detective with abundant resources and channels. You were actually able to solve this kind of case without any clues. Why do I feel a slight change in my spirituality? It seems like the potion has been digested a little more. In other words, my performance still enjoyed some limited success. However, there's only one person in the audience, and only he was fooled into seeing the wonderful outcome. An audience's applause really is effective. Klein was startled before he revealed a warm smile. Chapter 371. Detective Moriarty's first fan? No, it's just good luck. God was watching over me. Klein modestly stepped aside and invited Stewart in. What he said was the truth, and this matter did involve good luck. Long before Stewart had accepted the mission, he already knew of Emlyn White's whereabouts. Stewart shivered as he took off his coat and hat and hung them on a rack in the hall. The darn weather is getting colder. Perhaps I should try using those coats with cotton stuffed inside them, he said. You can't call this cold, right? If you go to the north of Mid-Seashire and live in Winter County for a day, you'll understand what truly low temperatures and true winter are like. Klein chuckled. Then he generously asked, a cup of hot coffee? I would love one. Stewart followed him to the activity room on the first floor. I've been to North Mid-Seashire, and I know about the cold and the snow there. It was a nice vacation, but Backlund's cold isn't inferior either. It went through my clothes like magic and seeped into my bones. Oh, what a wonderful fireplace. Stewart stood in front of the burning fireplace for 20 seconds before he sat down on the sofa. He looked at Klein, who was busy brewing instant coffee, and he said, I'm going south for a holiday to go fishing at Desi Bay for New Year's. What about you? Do you have any vacation plans? We put up with Backlund's air for a year and work hard to save money, all for such a holiday. Perhaps I should head to Desi Bay as well, Klein said hesitantly. He turned his head to the side of Stewart's face, and for a moment he seemed to be in a trance. This involved an agreement. An appointment with his elder brother, Benson, and sister, Melissa. Haha, I'll show you my fishing skills when the time comes. Stewart continued without end, we still aren't rich enough, otherwise I'd like to travel to Faysac, Intis, and even to the southern continent. After he finished making the coffee, Klein handed the man a white porcelain cup. He took 2 steps back and sat down across from him. Holding the cup in his hand, Stewart took 2 deep breaths of the fragrant and warm steam. After resting for a few seconds, he put the cup down and said very formally, according to our agreement, I'll share the reward I received this time with you. The Whites gave a total of £50, and you obviously did more than I did. Sherlock, how about £30? I still have to pay my informants for their work. Only £50? A vampire is only worth £50? Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon. But he also knew that it wasn't that the Whites didn't want to increase the bounty, it was because they were worried about giving too much money and scaring the detectives into making unnecessary associations, attracting the attention of the police or some official beyonder organization. To the average private detective, a £50 mission was already tempting enough, and Klein had only used £7 back then to hire detectives to investigate all the red chimney houses in the whole of Tingen City and the towns along its outskirts. In addition, the Whites gave you an extra £1, claiming it's for your transportation expenses for the past few days. Looking somewhat puzzled, Stewart produced 6 £5 notes and 1 £1 note. Klein reached out to take them, casually checked their authenticity, and didn't explain the transportation fees. Stewart didn't ask any further questions and instead said with a smile, apart from Mr. Stanton, you're the best detective I've ever met. Did you join this profession midway, or have you studied under a great detective prior to this? What great detective have I studied under? There's quite a number. There's Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, the forever elementary school student, and that guy who swindles others in the name of his grandfather Sup/Sups. Klein silently lampooned. He thought and said, I come from Mid-Seashire, and I did various jobs before I became a detective. That's why you're so rich in knowledge and experience. Stewart said in enlightenment. Hey, I'm a bit embarrassed by your flattery. Klein smiled but didn't respond. Stewart took a sip of his coffee and said, Sherlock, I hope you can provide me with help in the future if I encounter a difficult case that I'm unable to solve. My social connections in the detective circles have widened. Klein replied cautiously, if I have the time when the time comes. After some idle conversation, Stewart tactfully offered to take his leave, and Klein accompanied him to the door. After putting on his coat and hat, Stewart was about to open the door and leave when he suddenly turned around and sincerely said, Sherlock, you live too simply. Your talent deserves better coffee. Klein was stunned for a moment, but then he immediately felt a bit embarrassed. He laughed dryly and said, I can't tell the quality of the coffee. It's all the same to me. After sending Stuart off, Klein went to the butcher's to buy a few ox bones and some beef. He went to the vegetable shop to buy some ingredients such as white radish, rounding up all the required condiments. He wanted to prepare beef bone radish soup for dinner and eat it with the leftover rice. As for noon, he found a random restaurant on the streets and ate a small serving of lamb chop. After a leisurely afternoon, Klein continued to study the Book of Secrets, and the more he read, the more he realized that he knew little about mysticism. Fortunately, he had a solid foundation. He quickly grasped many things once he came into contact with them and pondered over them. In the evening, he smelled the tantalizing fragrance of the beef bone soup, and his Adam's apple bobbed up and down twice. He heard the doorbell again, as though it was a bugle to signal dinner time. Gulping down his saliva, Klein walked behind the door and reached for the handle. The image of the visitor naturally appeared in his mind. It was the handsome but not masculine red-eyed vampire, Emlyn White. There's no need to rush him at all. What a man of his word. Klein opened the door and smiled. Good evening, Mr. White. Emlyn raised his chin, letting his impatience show in his expression. He was about to say something when Klein looked at his brown clerical robes and said with a knowing smile, "You just came over from the Harvest Church? Who was the one who said he could resist last night?" Unable to maintain his gentlemanly demeanor, Emlyn gritted his teeth and said, that old man. Damn it, how do I get rid of this inducing suggestion?" Before Klein could reply, he patted the clothes on his chest and said with a stern face, "Take me to the patient. There's a good dinner waiting for me." As he spoke, he sniffed indiscernibly, as if he had smelled something. Klein picked up his coat and hat without saying another word. "All right, I'll take you there now." After closing the door and taking a few steps, he cautiously asked, "Do you have a certificate to practice medicine? How else am I supposed to convince Lawyer Jurgen to allow Mrs. Doris to take the medicine?" Emlyn looked up at the sky at a 45-degree angle and said, "I don't need those papers to prove my abilities." Before Klein frowned, he casually added, "It's too simple. I obtained it easily by going through the process." This tone makes it sound like he's rather proud of receiving a certificate for practicing medicine. Klein smiled without a word. Looking at the wet ground in front of him, Emlyn casually said, "Do you know what I like most about Backland?" "What?" Klein responded without any curiosity. Emlyn chuckled and said, "The persistent gloomy sky with fog that blots out the sun. This allows me to go out during the day without feeling too much discomfort. It's great except for the air." In other words, the sun really would deal certain damage to vampires? Fortunately, I thought of this yesterday and didn't bring the sun brooch with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to communicate with Emlyn. Klein seemed to gain an understanding. As they conversed, they had already arrived outside the Jurgens, and Klein went up to ring the doorbell. After a while, the door opened, and Mrs. Doris, who was dressed thickly at home, said with pleasant surprise, "Mr. Detective, I wasn't expecting you." Brody the black cat crouched to the side, looking at Emlyn warily, as though it felt that something was amiss about him. Klein pointed to the vampire beside him. "I became acquainted with a doctor who's good at treating lung diseases, so I've asked him to come and give you a checkup. Let me do the introductions. This is Dr. Emlyn White." "Is that so? You still actually remembered this? What a good child." Doris happily invited the two inside. Klein's mouth twitched, but he didn't say anything in the end. On the way into the living room, Emlyn whispered, "The patient's problems are irreversible. She's very old and rather weak. Even if I give her the medicine, she would only be able to live through this winter. She would pass away in 3 to 5 years. Unless she's given an immortal potion or the like as spoken in the legends, that's all that can be done. Or should I turn her into a sanguine? But at her age, she can no longer endure the changes a beyonder characteristic can do to her body. Furthermore, my parents and I don't have any excess characteristics left." Irreversible? Klein was startled and silently sighed. He said to Emlyn, "Make her the medicine first. We'll leave that to after the winter." "All right, I have a type of ready-made medicine with me that's suitable for this kind of situation." Emlyn didn't stand on ceremony as he sat down on the sofa. At that moment, Lawyer Jurgen was walking out of the kitchen as he took off his apron. He asked Klein about the purpose of his visit. "Dr. White, what do you think of my grandmother's lung disease?" Jurgen asked seriously. Emlyn was obviously very experienced in such situations. He first explained the ins and outs of lung disease, and after most of it flew past Jurgen's head, he said, "What she needs most is warm and healthy air. That's my most sincere advice. In addition, I have special medicine that she can take for free." As he spoke, he took out his certificate and a small metal bottle. "Will there be any side effects?" Jurgen asked cautiously. "No, the only problem is that it can't cure the root of the problem completely. It's just a temporary cure," Emlyn replied in a very professional manner. "If it weren't for Detective Moriarty, I wouldn't let anyone try it." "Perhaps I can give it a try?" "Cough," Mrs. Doris interrupted. Jurgen glanced at Klein who, having performed a divination prior to this, nodded affirmatively. "All right." Jurgen finally made his decision. He watched warily as Mrs. Doris drank the bottle of medicine and carefully observed her reaction. There wasn't much change to Mrs. Doris at first, but she gradually began to feel her breathing lighten. She stood up and bent down to pick up the cat. She happily said, "I feel much better." Seeing this scene, Jurgen's usually stoic face had his lips curl up slightly. However, Klein was thinking about the 3 to 5 years. He curled a smile and sighed to himself. "This can also be considered a type of magic show, I guess. Using beyonder powers to create fake outcomes to make the audience happy." Chapter 372, Missing Case. After waiting for more than half an hour and confirming that nothing unexpected had happened, Klein and Emlyn White left Lawyer Jurgen's house and proceeded in silence, each of them preoccupied with their own thoughts. Soon, they arrived outside 15 Minsk Street. The vampire, Emlyn White, put his fist to his mouth, coughed lightly and said, "The payment has been paid. I hope we won't meet again in the future." "That sounds pretty cool, but Mr. White, have you forgotten something important?" Klein smiled politely. "I will visit Bishop Utravsky every now and then, and I hope you will not be at the Harvest Church when the time comes. That way, I don't have to busy myself with finding a way to solve the inducing suggestion planted in your psyche." Emlyn White's expression suddenly became very strange. He stayed silent for 2 seconds before he raised his chin and said, "We have many powerful mysticologists among the sanguine. I will write to them for help." After he finished speaking, he pressed his hand to his chest and bowed to bid farewell. Turning around and taking a few steps, he suddenly slowed down, turned his head, and asked hesitantly, "What were you cooking over here?" "Beef bone radish soup, with rice and chili peppers from the Feynapotter Highlands," Klein said in anticipation as he breathed in the fragrance drifting out from the house. Emlyn frowned and shook his head. "Chili peppers aren't things fancied by the sanguine. Frankly speaking, it's hard for me to imagine a vampire eating chili peppers. Of course, I occasionally imagine a vampire holding a steamed bun and chewing on garlic and onions." Klein silently lampooned, pointed to the door, and indicated that he was about to enjoy his dinner. Emlyn White thought for a second, lowered his voice, and said in deliberation, "Last night, I thought over things for a long time and found out that you actually didn't do anything. So why are you asking for compensation? That old man would have let me leave at any moment." Klein chuckled. "No, that's not how the accounts are done. Your parents assigned a mission to find you, not to save you. In the end, I found you. According to the agreement, the reward should belong to me. Besides, if I hadn't reminded you, you might have stayed in Harvest Church for weeks or months before you realized that you were free to leave. Furthermore, you wouldn't have noticed the seed planted in your mind. Are you hinting that my intelligence isn't up to par?" Emlyn's face twisted. "No, I'm saying it directly." Klein smiled but didn't say anything else. He just opened the door and went straight to the kitchen, his mind full of the clear and alluring soup, the white rice, the soft yet chewy beef, the marrow hidden deep in the bones, the sweet, refreshing radishes with meaty flavors, and the shredded chili from the Feynapotter Highlands. In the spicy hot shreds, there were also pink rose salt and green parsley leaves. On Thursday morning, as promised, Klein went to the value-for-money coffee shop in East Borough. Old Kohler, who was still wearing the same thick jacket as before, was sitting in a corner, matching tea that barely tasted like tea with a loaf of black bread. Klein came in front of him, took out the things he had prepared long ago, and pushed them towards him. It was payment consisting of 2 5-soldi notes, 4 1-soldi notes, and a handful of copper pennies specially designed to increase the effect of the payment. Old Kohler stared straight at them for quite a while before finally reaching out his right hand to take them with a tremble. He looked at the money over and over again, raised his hand to wipe his eyes, and squeezed out a smile. At the dock, we carry the heavy goods and do some troublesome cleaning with our feet in the cold and dirty water, only for 1 soldi a day, and there was a total of 15 soldi here. Klein listened in silence. A few seconds later, he said, "What have you heard recently? What did you notice?" Old Kohler put away his payment, took another sip of his tea, pinched the corners of his eyes and said, "I've met a lot of dock workers, and I've reconnected with friends I used to know when I was a tramp. Some of them have found employment in factories, and some of them have been switching between the workhouse and the parks. Just like how I was in the past. Recently, there has been a rumor from who knows where that since we believe in one of the 7 gods, why don't we directly pray to the creator of everything? It's said that he didn't truly pass away, and he remains in everyone's body and in all things. Praying to him will result in our redemption. Not only will we enter his kingdom after death, but we will also have a better life before death. For example, we don't need to work so hard, and we can have butter and oily meat every day." Is this some theory the Aurora Order has spread about the fallen creator? After what happened to Lenivus, they've begun to pay attention to the poor in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district, hoping to use them for certain purposes. I wonder if the 3 churches have noticed this. They probably have. Klein tucked a piece of butter between 2 slices of toast and took a bite without knowing what to expect. Old Kohler went on for a while before saying, "Mr. Detective, according to your instructions, I paid attention to the female textile workers. In the end, with the help of the police, their struggles failed, but, the leaders became the factory's supervisors, and a third of them lost their jobs. Some of them are actively looking for new jobs, some have become street girls, and some have gone off somewhere. The entire East Borough is in chaos." If this was the situation when Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos came to Backlund, he could come to East Borough to kill 1 or 2 people every day without anyone discovering or noticing the act. Klein sighed in his heart. Old Kohler continued to recount what he saw and heard daily before saying, "By the way, Liv's youngest daughter has gone missing." Liv. Klein was certain that he had never heard of the name. Old Kohler then said in realization, "She's the laundry maid you and Mr. Reporter met last time, the one who was arguing with someone. She was always at home doing the washing with her 2 daughters, but yesterday, when her 2 daughters were returning home from delivering the laundry, one of them ended up missing. The younger one, what a pity. She's been a widow for years, and she has always been counting on her 2 daughters, and now. Sigh, the police in East Borough definitely won't look too hard for her. Unlucky people tend to meet with even worse situations because they have no ability to resist danger or change their environment." This phrase suddenly flashed through Klein's mind. After a few seconds of stone-like silence, he said, "Take me to see them. I'm a detective, so maybe I can help them find her." "They have no money," Old Kohler reminded him. Klein picked up his hat and cane and said, "I occasionally do volunteer work too. Sherwood Borough, in the apartment which the 2 ladies originally rented." Zio had resumed her life as a bounty hunter, and Furs hastened the pace of her new book, hoping to save the money needed for the Beyonder ingredients required by the Trickmaster potion. But writing a book wasn't something one could write that easily. Furs scratched her hair irritably and decided to go out for a walk to seek out inspiration. As she walked, she found that she had unknowingly returned to a familiar place. Diagonally ahead of her was the Yosefov Clinic, a fairly large private clinic where she had first worked. After staring at it for a while, Furs thought of the old lady who had guided her into the Beyonder world. She turned into a small alley on the right and took a shortcut to a nearby street. The 2 sides of the street had leaves fluttering down the parasol tree. It was a relatively quiet place. Furs remembered that the old lady lived at Unit 39. Back then, she would occasionally visit personally to deliver medicine, give injections, or even to help with the daily chores. It's almost been 3 years. That place should have been rented out again. There might have been several changes in tenants. I still remember when I came to tidy up the items she left behind. I discovered many notebooks about mysticism. Furs walked under the nearly barren parasol tree and slowly approached Unit 39. As she recalled her past experiences, she gradually gained some inspiration for writing. At that moment, she saw an old man in a heavy woolen coat and a black half-top hat standing in front of Unit 39. He had rung the bell 3 times. After a few minutes, seeing that no one was opening the door, the old man with blue eyes shook his head and turned around. He whispered in puzzlement, "Still no one." He suddenly noticed Furs, who was looking at him from nearby. He hurriedly walked over, gently and urgently smiled, and said, "Beautiful lady, do you live in this district? Do you know Lobero and Elisa?" "Elisa? Isn't that the old lady's name? There haven't been any tenants in this house lately?" After some deliberation, Furs said, "I don't know if the Mrs. Elisa I know is the one you're looking for. She lived here for a long time, but she passed away 3 years ago." "Passed away 3 years ago? What about Lobero?" The old man with wrinkles at the corners of his eyes hurriedly asked. "Her husband passed away even earlier than she did," Furs answered honestly. The elder was momentarily stunned before revealing a sorrowful expression. After a moment of silence, he said, "Thank you, good lady. I am the elder brother of Lobero, and I've been living in Mid-Seashire all this time. As I haven't received any letters from them for a long time, I decided to come and pay them a visit. Can you tell me what happened to them in the past few years?" Mrs. Elisa's husband's elder brother. Could he be a descendant of the family she spoke of? Furs suddenly snapped to her senses and replied with a smile, "No problem." She quickly thought through what she could and couldn't say. The elder pointed behind him and said, "There's quite a nice coffee shop over there." Klein once again stepped into the humid room of a slightly old apartment in East Borough. He saw the woman who had quarreled with the street girl last time over her contempt towards her profession. She was standing in a pile of clothes. Her wrinkled face had lost a lot of its spirit. She lost her laborious drive, and she looked lifeless. As for her eldest daughter, the 17 to 18-year-old girl who was sitting by the bed and washing clothes, she kept sobbing. "It's all my fault. I didn't watch over her properly. I shouldn't have taken her into the secluded alley." She even said that she was going to learn a few more words at the free school tonight. "It's my fault, it's all my fault." Liv suddenly regained her senses and turned to look at her eldest daughter. She wiped away her sad expression and berated her fiercely, "What are you crying for? Get up and wash the clothes. Do you want to starve? Do you plan on not even being able to attend the free school?" After screaming, she saw Klein and Old Kohler at the door. "Old Kohler, this is?" she asked doubtfully. Chapter 373. Search. Old Kohler seemed to be slightly afraid of her ferocity as he subconsciously took a step back. "Liv, this is a detective, and he wishes to help you find Daisy." Liv's wrinkled, peeling face turned to Klein and said coldly, "We've already made a police report." Although she was perhaps in her 30s, she looked to be in her 50s. Klein looked around the room where many wet clothes hung. He vaguely remembered the last time he was here. There had been a 13 or 14-year-old girl, carefully holding a crude homemade iron to iron the clothes which had wrinkled from being hung to dry. Her hands had been covered with burns. "She's the missing Daisy?" Klein looked back at the laundry maid Liv and said in a neutral tone, "Do you believe that the East Borough Police will really be looking for Daisy? Are you sure the people who caused Daisy to go missing wouldn't cast their sights on your family? Do you wish to lose another daughter after losing one?" When the cruel yet heart-wrenching words reached Liv's ears, the indifferent expression on her face slowly crumbled. She turned agape, but she couldn't say anything. The corners of her eyes gradually turned red. She abruptly lowered her head and muttered to herself in pain and despair, "I don't have any money." The room suddenly became silent. Even the sobbing girl didn't make another sound. Klein pursed his lips and let out a silent sigh. "I occasionally do volunteer work, simply to help others. Heh, I haven't done so in a long time, so please give me a chance." "Volunteer work?" Liv lifted her head and ruminated over the phrase. Klein nodded slightly and answered, "The job will be done pro bono." "No, it is not completely free either. Kindness will bring me great satisfaction. Since you have no other solutions, why not give it a try?" Liv was silent for a moment. She raised her hand, which had wrinkled from being soaked in water for an extended period of time, wiped her eyes, and said in a low voice, "Mr. Detective, you really are a kind and good gentleman." Her voice suddenly became choked with sobs. This was what happened. At midday before yesterday, at noon, Daisy delivered a load of washed laundry under Fraja's lead. It was just outside Eastborough, and they needed to cross several streets. In order to rush back for lunch, Fraja had chosen a secluded alley, but a momentary distraction left her realizing that Daisy, who had been following her, was gone. She retraced her route but never found Daisy, and Daisy hasn't come back yet. "Where did this happen, Fraja?" The girl named Fraja had already stood up, her eyes were red and puffy. She sobbed and said, right here in Broken Axe Lane, Mr. Detective. Will Daisy be all right?" "Probably," Klein replied without much of an expression. He looked around and asked, "Do you have anything that Daisy often carries? I can borrow a police dog. It has an excellent sense of smell and can be used to find a person based on the lingering scent." "No," Liv thought for a moment and said with a sad expression. Fraja once again shed tears. She felt as if the situation had turned into one of despair once again. Suddenly, she blinked and said, "Wait, there's something. Daisy's vocabulary book." "Vocabulary book?" Old Kohler asked. Liv sniffed and said, "I make Fraja and Daisy attend the free school at night. I can keep washing clothes, but they can't always be doing the same. This lady is such a good mother." Klein couldn't help but sigh. The free classes offered at night were set up by the 3 major churches or some charity organizations. From 8 to 10 o'clock in the evening, the school would be free of charge and would even provide stationery and a certain amount of paper. It was an education that was need-blind, and it would at most involve some religious knowledge. Klein had heard old Neil mention that he had once been a teacher for the Church of the Evernight Goddess for several years. Because there were very few people who volunteered to be teachers in the free school, a unique teaching method was established. Teachers would arrive early, gather the few students who had the best academic progress, imbue them with the content for that day's class, and then put them in charge of teaching the different classes. The teachers would supervise, correcting any mistakes. It was called a tutorial system. Corresponding to the free classes were the free organizations such as the Technical Workers Workshop, which were truly accessible to the poor, and one of the few outlets to escape from poverty. Unfortunately, there were too few similar organizations, and it was difficult for them to play a substantial role. At this moment, the sobbing Fraja added, Daisy liked studying very much. She was made the tutor of her class by her teacher. She would put together the vocabulary words she had copied and hug them in her bed every day. She would wake up early and go out into the street to recite them under the light of dawn. She's always found it regretful that there are no street lamps around here. As she spoke, Fraja rushed back to the bunk bed and took out a stack of crumpled paper from under the tattered pillow. Due to it being in a humid environment for extended periods of time, the words that were copied on it had already smudged. The edges of the sheets of paper were worn out, as though they had been turned over and over by someone for a long time. Mr. Detective, is this okay? Fraja handed Klein the so-called vocabulary book, which had no binding at all, and anxiously asked. Yes, Klein answered very simply. He wasn't trying to comfort Fraja. Although it wasn't the kind of items Daisy carried around all the time, it was something that had accompanied her all this while. Moreover, it had been projected with Daisy's strong will. It was excellent for using it as dowsing to seek her out. He casually flipped through the vocabulary book and said, Then I'll start taking action. The earlier I find Daisy, the better. Liv and Fraja were unable to find words to describe their feelings. All they could do was watch as Klein and Old Kohler leave, repeating the words, Thank you, Mr. Detective, and Thank you, good gentleman. After leaving the apartment, Klein turned to Old Kohler and said, You should pay attention to those female textile workers who lost their jobs, especially those who have neither found new jobs nor become street girls, and pay more attention to those who have gone off to unknown places. Pay attention to your own safety. Ask less and listen more. If you do this well, you'll get a bonus. All right. Old Kohler nodded heavily. He didn't immediately bid farewell. After hesitating for a moment, he asked with a tone full of expectation, "You'll find Daisy, won't you, Mr. Detective?" "I can only say that I will do my best." Klein didn't make any guarantees. Old Kohler sighed and smiled bitterly. "I've lost my child, so I'm very unwilling to see this sort of thing happen." He waved his hand and walked towards another street. Klein left the area at a leisurely pace, wrapping Daisy's vocabulary book around the head of the cane and, without attracting any attention, completed a dowsing rod seeking. There are results. Towards the northwest. For the time being, it's not possible to confirm if I'm suffering any interference or misdirection. He looked down at the direction in which the cane was going to fall and put out his palm to steady it. According to the revelation, Klein went all the way out of Eastborough and hired a rental carriage. Half an hour later, the carriage, which occasionally changed directions, stopped at Iris Street, near Sherwood Borough and West Borough. It stopped in front of a house with a vast lawn, a wide garden, a small fountain square, and a marble statue. At this moment, Klein's cane had fallen down inside the carriage and was aimed straight at that direction. Through the window, Klein could see the guards patrolling inside the gates and ferocious dogs with their tongues out. The security inside was quite tight. More importantly, even without using divination, his spiritual intuition made him sense that there was great danger hidden within. What is this place? How can Daisy's disappearance involve such a dangerous place? Klein thought for a few seconds, then he told the carriage driver to keep going. The carriage driver replied with some surprise, "Sir, are you not here to visit Mr. Capham?" Capham? The name sounded extremely familiar to Klein. He smiled and asked, "Why do you think so?" "There will always be people coming out from Eastborough who ride in my carriage all the way here." "Ha, this is the home of the rich and powerful Mr. Capham," the carriage driver casually replied. Eastborough? Capham? Who? Klein suddenly remembered who Capham was. There were many rumors that he was the leader of a bloody criminal organization which was stained with blood. He was involved in the disappearance of many innocent girls. And in reality, he was a tycoon who knew quite a few important figures. Without another word, Klein leaned back against the wall and half closed his eyes. The horse carriage slowly moved forward. The luxurious villa was left behind as it disappeared from the window. In a small booth in a coffee shop, Furs already knew that the old man across her was called Lawrence Nord, who came from Mid-Seashire's Constant City and was a public school teacher. He didn't know that Mrs. Allisa's husband was dead, nor that Mrs. Alisa had inherited his estate and become a beyonder, much less know that Mrs. Alisa had left me her relics. Could he also be a beyonder? Does he have the ability to divine? After taking a sip of Fermo coffee, she organized her words and said, "I was a doctor at the nearby Yosefov Clinic, and Mrs. Alisa came to see me often. That was when her husband, Mr. Labero, had already passed away. Sometimes I would accompany her by chatting with her and helping her do things like. So in the end, she made a will, giving me her savings and cash. She donated jewelry, books, furniture, and other things to a charity. This was done under the supervision of her assigned law firm." Furs was telling the truth, but not the whole truth. Lawrence pinched his forehead and said, "What a pity. I don't understand why Alisa didn't contact me over all those years." "She didn't mention your name. She was vaguely dissatisfied with Mr. Labero's family," Furs replied frankly. Lawrence fell silent for a moment before saying, "Thank you for informing me. It has made me understand certain things. By the way, where are Labero and Alisa buried?" "Grimm's Cemetery." Furs took out a pocket watch and gave it a look before saying, "Mr. Lawrence, I still have things to tend to. I should be leaving." Lawrence didn't stop her. He got up and saw her off. After sitting down again, he rubbed his temples in distress and silently muttered to himself, "Labero is dead, and he didn't leave any children behind, and I don't know what Alisa did to his beyonder characteristic. Richard died at the hands of the Aurora Order. Sam doesn't even wish to contact us at all, having no interest in shouldering the responsibility of the family name. Will the Abraham family slowly disappear like this? Chapter 374. Artificial sleepwalking. Lawrence sat in the coffee shop booth, unable to stop himself from thinking about the hardships of the Abraham family over the years. Ever since they had split up into smaller families and settled in other places, the Elder Council's control over the family members hit rock bottom. A great number of Abrahams refused to advance, in order to avoid the effects of the curse. Hence, many of them remained at sequence 8 or 9. Some didn't even attempt to become Beyonders, wishing to be ordinary people with a certain amount of knowledge so as to live a calm and peaceful life. The Elder Council believed that this was an act of forgetting the family's honor, but it couldn't be harsh on such actions since it was tantamount to self-destruction. In such a situation, the upper echelons of the Abraham family began to think of introducing changes. They imitated the teacher-apprentice inheritance system of the life school of thought, and they trained non-family members, hoping that once they advanced to become high-sequence Beyonders, then they would, in turn, be able to help the Abraham family deal with the curse that had existed for about 1,500 years and find their ancestor, Bethel Abraham, who had vanished in the War of the Four Emperors. The plan started off smoothly, and the apprentices who didn't have to worry about the curse quickly became stronger and stronger under the Abraham family's meticulous nurturing. Within a short period of 10 years, there were several strong sequence 5 individuals among them, while not a single person among the direct descendants of the Abraham family was sequence 6. The trunk was too weak, but the branches were too strong. Hence, the seeds of tragedy were planted, and the ambitious apprentices began casting their sights on the powerful sealed artifacts that the Abraham family possessed. Their plot failed, but it also resulted in serious repercussions. All the non-family members at sequences 6 and 5 were of the opinion that their positions within the Abraham family didn't match their own strength and that they couldn't be trusted, preventing them from being in possession of certain sealed artifacts. In the process of going back and forth, with difficult negotiations occurring and compromises between the two parties, an accident happened. One of them, Traveler Bodis, was lured by the true creator into joining the Aurora Order, which led to a terrible disaster. In this disaster, the upper echelons of the Abraham family were almost completely destroyed. More than half of the few powerful sealed artifacts were lost, and only 3 were left. As a result, Lawrence's brother, who he shared the same mother with, Richard, died. Not only did Bodis benefit greatly from it, but he also gathered all the Beyonder ingredients he needed, and with the help of the true creator he successfully overcame the dangers and became a demigod, becoming one of the 5 saints of the Aurora Order, the Saint of Mystery. After the disaster, the rebuilt Abraham family's Elder Council reflected over the actions of the past few years, but they couldn't find a solution to the problem. Emotions such as negativity, dejection, and hopelessness shrouded the hearts of the few remaining family members. Lawrence didn't wish to be placed in such an environment or face sighing and repressed emotions every day. He found a reason to leave the Elder Council and came to Backlund to look for his other brothers, Labero, who he shared the same mother, and Sam, who he didn't share the same mother. But now, he suddenly realized that he was the only one remaining from his father's line. He was already nearly 80 years old, and all his children had died in the disaster brought about by Bodis. Just recalling the past made him feel sorrow from the bottom of his heart. The most painful thing was that he couldn't see the hope for revenge, and he couldn't see the dawn of his clan's glory appearing once more. I'm already very old, and I was also injured before. Unless it's absolutely necessary, I wouldn't dare to use my Beyonder powers anymore, which would cause me to lose control or even cause the curse to descend. What is the future of the Abraham family? Lawrence took a sip of the Fermo coffee and fell into a long silence. Upon returning to her rented house, Furs immediately entered the bedroom and locked the wooden door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, calmed her mind, and whispered the honorific name that represented hope and the future. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. You are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog. You are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. I wish to inform you of what I have encountered today. I met the elder brother of the husband of the old lady who made me become an apprentice. He seems to be a member of a certain family. I didn't mention anything related to mysticism, but I'm worried that he has extremely powerful divination abilities and will be able to find out the complete truth. At this moment, Klein happened to be above the gray fog. He saw the crimson star that represented the magician expanding outward, rippling as he heard the stacked layers of pleas. After figuring out the details, Klein tapped the edge of the ancient table and said to himself silently, "How cautious for her to know to seek help from the fool. Besides, your guess isn't wrong. The corresponding sequence 7 for apprentice is astrologer." Having recently read the Book of Secrets thoroughly, he had quickly come up with a plan that would help him interfere with divination through rituals. I have to say, with the Book of Secrets and my advancement to sequence 7, I'm becoming more and more godlike when above the gray fog. Of course, for the time being, I'm still just an empty shell. Speaking of which, I've been acting in front of Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man several times, fooling them completely. Why didn't I receive any feedback from my spirituality? The speed at which I digest the potion doesn't seem to be getting faster as a result. Does it have to happen in the real world? Yes, it might be possible that their applause, as an audience, has been blocked by the gray fog, preventing them from directly affecting me. Just like how the eternal blazing sun and the true creator are unable to penetrate the gray fog to find this mysterious space. From the looks of it, the reaction between the gray fog and this mysterious space is very mechanical. It's not sentient enough, and it lacks intelligence. However, to me, this is actually a good thing. In the midst of his thoughts, Klein turned his knowledge into an ancient piece of goatskin and threw it into the crimson star that symbolized the magician. A boundless grayish-white fog suddenly filled the air in front of Furz's eyes, and an illusory yellowish-brown goatskin descended from the sky. When she saw the information written on it, she suddenly felt at peace. With Mr. Fool, Mr. Lawrence certainly wouldn't be able to get the correct revelations via divination. Furz sincerely expressed her gratitude and busily prepared for the ritual. She had seen a lot of instances where evil spirits did harm to others. In fact, she didn't trust the fool that much, but the curse of the full moon forced her to rely on him. Regardless of how bad the consequences are, I will just lose my life. Without the help of Mr. Fool, I would have already lost control during the last blood moon and become a monster. Every day I live is a day gained. This is all given to me by Mr. Fool, and he can take it back at any time. Well, it's best if he doesn't. Furz took a breath and lit the 2 candles that symbolized the fool. The initial steps of the ritual were no different from those she had mastered before. This continued until the candles were lit and the essential oils, extract, and herbal powder were thrown into the fire. When the fragrance of a serene etherealness filled the room, a faint, illusory fog covered the entire altar. According to the contents of the goatskin, Furz quickly adjusted her body and mind, entered cogitation and chanted the corresponding name of the fool over and over again. Such monotonous, repetitive behavior allowed the originally calm and relaxed Furz to slowly enter a state where the mind was in deep sleep while her spirituality dispersed. Her entire being felt groggy, but she maintained a strange sense of lucidness. She felt as if her spirit was floating about, constantly moving upwards. This was similar to the secret deed process that was formed with the help of an external object, but it was different in many ways. This was a technique in mediumship and was used to communicate with higher-level spirits. At an extremum, it could even allow a beyonder to travel the spirit world under the pretext of maintaining a special lucidness. Some beyonders who specialized in influencing the mind called it artificial sleepwalking. They could use techniques such as hypnosis to make ordinary people enter this state as well. In that way, an ordinary person would appear to be in a deep slumber, yet they would be able to answer questions. Although their eyes and mouths were closed, they could detect the presence of various spirit bodies around them, thus completing a certain degree of communication. The reason why Klein didn't let Furz use the secret deed ritual was that it could only give knowledge or direct effects such as purification or corruption, letting the target's mind gain a wonderful experience. It couldn't interfere with the divination or other matters done by another person. Simply put, The secret deed ritual directly affected the target spirit body, astral projection, body of heart and mind, and ether body. The related positive or negative states were removed, and with the artificial sleepwalking ritual, it allowed Klein to do something indirect so as to deal with any outside interference. In a daze, Furs felt herself drifting back to the majestic old palace above the gray fog, and she saw Mr. Fool sitting high above, looking down at everything. Klein looked at the image of the magician projected by the dark red starlight. He unhurriedly picked up a paper figurine that he had found earlier from his trash pile in the corner. As a seer who had advanced twice, he had many ways to interfere with the divination of others, so he didn't need to rely on mystical items to help him. At this moment, due to the effects of the ritual, the mysterious space above the gray fog started to tremble slightly, and some of the power was flowing due to the perturbation. Klein's left hand pressed the Dark Emperor card on the surface of the long bronze table, connecting it with his own spirit body and uplifting himself to a higher level. It raised his level just like the previous times he used the flaring sun charm and Azek's copper whistle to solidify his spirit body. Then, with a flick of his right wrist, he threw the paper figurine out. The paper figurine suddenly expanded in size, and on its back, 12 pairs of black angel wings which were cut out of paper grew out. The feathers were vivid and lifelike. The paper angel pierced through the dark red light and overlapped with the illusory figure of the magician. Without any warning, it started to burn and completely disappeared. The half-awake Furs seemed to see a dignified and majestic angel as it wrapped layer upon layers of pitch-black wings around her. After an unknown period of time, Furs suddenly awoke from her artificial sleepwalking state. In front of her were only the 3 candles quietly burning on the altar and the fog that had permeated the entire room. At the tip of her nose was the familiar fragrance of serene etherealness. Angel. Furs was so lost in thought that she momentarily forgot to end the ritual. Chapter 375. An Evil Gods, Impressive Act 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there were 12 pairs of wings. According to the canon descriptions of the various churches, that's an angel of the highest rank. Furs tried to recall what she had seen in her reverie. She was both shocked and not that shocked, as if what she had encountered was a shocking event that she had previously taken for granted but had simply never encountered before. It isn't surprising that Mr. Fool has the services of an angel. From the fact that Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man occasionally use the word him to refer to him, one can imagine so. The fact that he's able to isolate the effects of the moon's ravings allows me to infer. However, my request was only to interfere with Mr. Lawrence's divination, yet he actually made an angel protect me. Isn't this too extravagant? Or is this a routine act for him? One more problem. Why are the feathers on the angel's wings black? Does this signify degeneracy or death? What is the true identity of Mr. Fool? Which great being is he? Death, who was rumored to have died in the Pale Era? He wishes to be reborn through the tarot gatherings? Furs suddenly took a deep breath, completely unconcerned that the gentleman named Lawrence would find anything wrong with her through his divination. On the realization that she had already joined the tarot club, she smiled wryly and whispered silently, "I can only do as Emperor Roselle said, take things one step at a time." After gathering her thoughts, Furs humbly thanked Mr. Fool once more. Following the normal process of a ritual, she extinguished the 3 candles' flame and began to clear the altar, which was filled with all kinds of items. Above the gray fog, Klein temporarily put the matter of the Abraham family at the back of his mind. According to his original plan, he conjured a pen and paper and wrote the following divination statement: Daisy's current situation. Putting the fountain pen away, Klein stacked Daisy's vocabulary book and the piece of paper with the divination statement on it and held them in his left hand. Then, leaning back in his chair, he entered a state of cogitation, reciting the words, Daisy's current situation, over and over again. After 7 times, Klein fell asleep, his eyes black with a hint of red before grayness surfaced in them. One scene after another began to flash. Some were contiguous, some had gaps, and some were completely incoherent. Klein saw Liv's youngest daughter, a 13, or 14-year-old girl who persisted despite being repeatedly scalded. She was dragged into a remote alley by a man wearing a heavy jacket and a grayish-black cap after he covered her mouth with a handkerchief from behind. Another man, who was dressed the same, took her legs, and they lifted her as they quickly walked away. Their destination was the carriage parked outside the alley. The whole incident was over in less than 2 minutes, and by the time Daisy's sister, Freja, returned to search for Daisy, the carriage was already gone. Within the carriage, a sharp, ice-cold dagger was held to the muddle-headed Daisy's face, and lewd threats rang in her ears. The carriage drove into the luxurious villa. Daisy was in a small, dark room, and from time to time, the sound of women's cries, screams, and curses echoed outside. Daisy woke up and cried out for help, but the door was opened, and she was kicked away. The pain made it impossible for her to get up. She wept as she constantly cried for Mother and Freja. Klein opened his eyes and realized that the paper he held in his left hand had already been crumpled by his tight grip. He had established that Capum was the mastermind behind the many disappearances of young ladies and that he was the boss of a criminal organization. The problem, however, was that the case shouldn't and couldn't involve powerful Beyonder forces. At most, there would be a few money-hungry Beyonders at Sequence 7, 8, or 9 that were helping out. It wouldn't have made Klein's spiritual intuition give him warnings of intense danger the moment he approached the villa. Is Capum himself a Sequence 6 or even Sequence 5 Beyonder? However, it's not difficult for a Beyonder of this level to earn money. There's no need to do such dirty and complicated matters. He just has to find all the gangs and collect protection fees via a protection racket. It would be easy, and it wouldn't dirty his hands. Could there be some hidden plot behind Capum's human trafficking? As he pondered, Klein used the power of the gray fog to restore Daisy's vocabulary book to its original state. After a few seconds of silence, he took out another piece of goatskin and wrote a new divination statement. Saving Daisy is a dangerous matter. After reading it carefully twice, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist, letting the topaz pendant fall and hang above the surface of the paper, almost to the point of touching the statement. After taking a few seconds to compose himself, he closed his eyes and began to recite the divination statement he had just written. When he finished reciting it, Klein opened his eyes and looked at the pendulum in his left hand. The topaz pendant was rotating clockwise at a fairly fast frequency and with a rather high amplitude. This meant that saving Daisy was a rather dangerous act. However, it isn't one of total despair. There's still a possibility, a significant chance of success, as long as I can seize it. Klein deciphered the revelation from the spirit pendulum. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and said with a self-deprecating smile, "Wasn't I looking for an opportunity to perform? This is it. As a magician, I have to challenge something of a higher difficulty. Otherwise, I would be called a trick master and not a magician." Completing the seemingly impossible, even if the outcome is nothing but an illusion, that's the image of a magician in my heart. As for whether it's one of the rules or not, I still need confirmation. Klein tapped the edge of the ancient table and quickly made his decision. To him, the most troubling thing about saving Daisy and dealing with Capum was that he didn't know anything about Capum. He didn't know how many other Beyonders were in the villa or the sequences and pathways they had. This made Klein unable to make specific preparations. And for a magician, the first rule was, never perform unprepared. Many seemingly impromptu performances actually involved significant preparations. For example, long periods of practice or thorough mastery of diverting attention away from the situation. Should I get Miss Justice's help to learn more about Capum's background from my adorer? Klein seriously considered the options available to him. However, he quickly rejected this idea. No, I won't be able to receive detailed information. Although Capum is involved with many powerful figures and the wealthy, it's not something that can be publicized. Miss Justice will, at most, learn of the nobles, members of parliament, or civil servants which he is involved with, but she won't be able to determine how many Beyonders are in his villa, much less the traps or the layout. Through the clues from these connections, Miss Justice might be able to figure out what I wish to know given a few weeks' time, but that's too slow. Rescuing Daisy needs to be done as soon as possible. Any delays will result in a tragedy. Klein's eyes swept across the surface of the long bronze table and onto the junk pile in the corner. His mind began to formulate an idea. On the one hand, I can get Miss Magician and her friend, Miss Sayo, to investigate Capham's background and determine which Beyonders he has ties with. The two ladies are very well connected in East Borough, several gangs, and a considerable number of Beyonder circles. On the other hand, I can take action by myself. I can obtain information from the servants or bodyguards that come out from Capham's villa via mediumship. After finalizing his plan, Klein was in no hurry to get help from Miss Magician. He decided to try doing it by himself first so that he could find out more about the matter in a targeted manner. In the blink of an eye, his figure disappeared from the towering palace above the gray fog. After lunch, a man wearing a grayish-black cap and a thick cotton coat cautiously left from the back door of Capham's villa. He walked all the way to a crossroad and got into a rental carriage. East Borough. He touched the dark red birthmark on his face and instructed the carriage driver. The carriage began to move, and the man looked out of the window with a bored expression, admiring the beautiful ladies and young ladies on the streets. If only we could kidnap them. The man let his imagination run wild as he revealed a regretful expression. When he was far from Iris Street, he suddenly shivered, and his eyes became slightly dazed. He knocked on the wall and said to the carriage driver, "Stop, stop. I forgot something. Here will do." The carriage driver didn't dare to reprimand the ferocious man. He didn't even mutter as he stopped the carriage by the side of the street and allowed him to alight. After paying 6 pence for the ride, the man retraced the direction in which he came for dozens of meters before entering a cheap hotel. Without the need for any proof of identity, he paid for a room. After entering, he left the door ajar without locking it. Then, the man sat on the edge of the bed with a deadpan expression. Suddenly, a transparent and illusory figure separated from his body. It was none other than Klein, who was dressed as a worker. He had used the method of summoning himself to transform into a spirit body and had attached himself to this man's body, allowing him to walk to a convenient location for mediumship. After knocking the man out, Klein's spirit form disappeared from the room. Not long after, the door was pushed open, and he walked into the room in his corporeal form. Using a wall of spirituality to seal the place, Klein quickly set up a mediumship ritual, allowing the alluring scent of amantha extract and eye of the spirit medicine to emanate in the surroundings. After finishing his preparations and just as he was about to start the mediumship, he suddenly exclaimed and stopped his actions. He discovered that the spirit body of the man who was unconscious on the bed had a mysterious, unknown restriction. If he forcefully did the mediumship, although there was a high probability of success, it would activate the seal and cause some Beyonder to notice this occurrence. This would end up alerting the enemy. Such a strange Beyonder power. Very cautious and very careful. What Capham is involved in isn't simple at all. Klein took a few steps forward, frowning slightly. He glanced at the unconscious man and suddenly chuckled. "Do you think you can stop me with just this?" He quickly suspended the ritual, summoned himself again, and responded to himself. A few seconds later, he flew out of the candle's flame in his spirit body form and floated in the room once more. Without any hesitation, Klein, in his spirit body form, suddenly approached and possessed the unconscious man. The man suddenly sat up and opened his eyes. His expression appeared lifeless. He straightened his body, walked to the front of the altar, step by step, and then chanted in a low voice, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, you are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog. You are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck." Chapter 376. Mr. Horace in a room filled with the ethereal fragrance of amantha extract and eye of the spirit medicine, Capham's henchman, who had been possessed by Klein, was made to chant the fool's honorific name. Amidst the monotonous yet rhythmic murmurs and the fragrance that made it difficult to focus, the man's spirit body gradually dissipated. He became muddle-headed but maintained a certain degree of unusual lucidity, as if he was hypnotizing himself. With Klein's help, in his spirit body form and the feedback from the chanting the fool's honorific name, He slowly entered an artificial sleepwalking state. His astral projection approached the infinitely high gray fog and the mysterious location above the gray fog. Klein seized the opportunity, ended the summoning, and returned to the towering ancient palace, where he sat at the seat belonging to the fool. He saw a bright light circle rippling around him, sketching out the illusory figure of Capim's henchman. The mysterious space was affected by the ritual as it trembled slightly. Some of the energy was being pried away and was slowly flowing. Klein picked up the Dark Emperor card, and a paper figurine flashed in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, the paper figurine flew out and absorbed the sliver of energy that had been pried out of the gray fog. It then transformed into a man wearing a black cap and a thick cotton jacket. He looked identical to Capim's henchman. Even his aura and feel was indistinguishable from the real person. This paper figurine overlapped with the target's illusory figure and helped him resist the mysterious and unknown restrictions placed within his spirit body. At the same time, Klein held the Dark Emperor card and spread his spirituality, touching the projection of Capim's henchman formed by the pure light. This was one of the applications of secret deeds, where a weak human and a great being were able to be a little in tune with each other, feeling the corresponding knowledge and gaining a wonderful spiritual experience. Unlike normal circumstances, Klein was playing the role of the great being in this instance. In this kind of close interactive state that belonged to a secret deed, humans could gain knowledge from great existences, and great existences could also naturally use questions to obtain the information they wanted. If it wasn't for Klein's inability to master the field of the mind, he would have been able to plant an inducing suggestion. What kind of powerful people are in Capim's villa? Klein asked through the interactive spirituality state. Without any resistance, the projection transmitted the memories to Klein, making him feel like he was watching a holographic film. The man in the cap stood respectfully and fearfully in the room. In front of him was a middle-aged gentleman in a black tailcoat and a white wig. This gentleman had a long, thin, and stern face, and his mouth was naturally pursed, giving off an exceptionally cold feeling. He followed the golden chain on his watch, took out a pocket watch of the same color, pressed it open to take a look, and then he said in a deep voice, "Look at me." The man in the cap didn't dare to disobey as he raised his head and looked in front of him. "Yes, Mr. Horace." Before he could finish his words, he saw a pair of eyes that flickered with a strange light, and he heard a command, "Maintain secrecy. You can't leak anything you see or hear in this villa to anyone else." The man in the cap trembled inexplicably, feeling that he had to do as the other party had ordered. He lowered his head again and said, "Yes, Mr. Horace." The man in the cap carried an unconscious girl along the stairs to the entrance of the basement. There was a small room that was separated from the others, and a bearded man with an unknown age was sitting inside it. This bearded man had a pair of frighteningly cold blue eyes. He held a thin piece of flannel in his hand and was carefully cleaning the grayish-white rifle on the table. The rifle was thick and long, connected through a pipe to a large mechanical box of the same color. It was a high-pressure steam rifle. That was a military-controlled item. "Mr. Belize," the man in the cap bowed his head in greeting. The man in the cap entered a neatly arranged underground structure which resembled a prison. He then locked the unconscious girl in one of the small rooms. He locked the door, returned to the corridor, and picked up the lantern he had been assigned. At that moment, he saw a figure slowly approaching from the other end of the corridor. The figure seemed to be able to see through the darkness without any lighting. With the aid of the lantern, the man in the cap realized that it was a woman in her 30s. The woman was wearing a brown bonnet, a thin white blouse, and suspenders, as well as leather boots that reached her knees. There were old scars on her face and a cruel smile at the corners of her mouth. The man in the cap lowered his head in fear as he stammered, "Ma'am Katie." The woman ignored him. Step by step, she approached him and walked past him, as though he was nothing more than air. When the lady named Katie had left, the man in the cap curled his lips and said, "Bitch, when you get into bed, you'll definitely be more energetic than a prostitute." He pushed up his crotch, held up the lantern, and left the basement. The man in the cap met two men in the grand hall that shimmered gold. One of them was about 1.65 meters tall, and he was a little plump. He didn't have any special features, but his eyes always had a frightening look. The other was slightly taller than 170 meters, and he looked a bit old. He had some wrinkles and a high nose bridge. His brown eyes were filled with spirit, and he didn't seem to have a look of deterrence. Mr. Capim, the man in the cap greeted the plump middle-aged man, then he said to another person, Mr. Parker? In the early light of dawn, the man in the cap met the cold middle-aged gentleman called Mr. Harris at the entrance to the basement. Harris, wearing a white hood, glanced at him, who was standing respectfully by the side. He indifferently stretched out his right palm towards the entrance of the basement and solemnly said, Confinement. Silently, there was a subtle difference in the surroundings. There are a total of 4 Beyonders. At least 4 of them. The strongest should be that Mr. Harris, a sequence 6 at the very least, or maybe even sequence 5. I wonder what pathway it is. It does seem similar to the Dark Emperor pathway, relying on order and issuing commands. Judging from the scenes just now, the restrictions pertain only to the basement, not the entire villa. That's right. With so many people coming and going during the day, it would be too troublesome to enter and exit once the restrictions are in place. I wonder if it's the same at night. Klein analyzed the information he had just received and asked again, what's the overall layout of the villa? He quickly received feedback and saw a magnificent hall, a wide dining room, connected corridors, washrooms, and scenes of the basement. Through them, Klein pieced together in his mind the rough layout of Capim's villa. Feeling the drain on his spirituality, he asked a final question. Who are the important figures whom Capim is closely related to? The scene in front of his eyes was the magnificent hall from before. Half-naked girls were prostrating themselves while serving the guests drinks, letting them abuse them or fool around with them. Otherwise, they were being dragged directly to a secluded spot to be ravaged. They were young, and their faces were bitter and numb. Any slight delay or lack of enthusiasm would result in them being whipped by Capim's attendants or maidservants. None of these servants showed a shred of sympathy despite seeing such evil scenes. They fought to be the first to showcase themselves in a bid to obtain rewards. Klein saw Capim among the guests, the cold Mr. Harris, and a member of parliament from the House of Commons who often appeared in the newspapers, Vardara, a fat man who was addressed as deputy chief. Is that one of the deputy chiefs of the Backland Police Department? That's one of the higher-ups of the police department. To think that not a single one of those servants are good, that's understandable. The villa's hired personnel must have been screened before and would have to be sufficiently trustworthy. Klein rubbed his forehead, halting the secret deed ritual. The man in the cap was only an inconsequential leader, and that was all he could know or participate in. Even at this moment, the mysterious restriction on him was still unperturbed. Klein ended the ritual and allowed him to vanish from above the gray fog as he returned to the real world. He sat by the bed and looked at the man in the cap who was unconscious. According to the information he had just gathered, he analyzed the feasibility of a performance and considered one plan after another. In the end, Klein came up with a definite idea. He whispered to himself, perhaps, I don't need a helper. A helper would drag me down instead, making it inconvenient for me to escape in times of danger. Picking the right time is very important. Nearly 50 minutes later, the man in the blackish-gray cap appeared in East Borough as he headed straight for the streets controlled by the Zmanger gang. As soon as he saw a few dark-skinned, lean people with ferocious looks, he immediately went close. Pretending to not watch where he was going, he bumped into one of them. Damn it! You bunch of trash! The man in the cap cursed loudly and punched at one of them. Highlanders, who loved to fight, didn't back down and entered a brawl with him. In the process, the man in the cap pulled out his dagger, and the other Highlanders also drew their weapons. During the battle, a dagger stabbed into the capped man's neck as he failed to dodge in time. It went right into his arteries. The man in the cap fell as red blood pooled around his head. He quickly lost his life, and the illusory, transparent figure within his body immediately vanished. Klein returned above the gray fog, and using it as a springboard, he re-entered his body. He then opened his eyes in the cheap hotel in Sherwood Borough. He cleaned up the rest of the evidence and went to the front desk to check out of the room. On his way back to Minsk Street, Klein once again went above the gray fog. He wanted to divine a simple but crucial piece of information. He picked up a fountain pen and wrote down a line of text, "Capim's dinner time today." Chapter 377. Capim's dinner. Putting down his dark red fountain pen, Klein picked up the piece of paper with the divination statement and leaned back in his chair. His lips moved as he whispered, "Capim's dinner time today," over and over again. Klein's voice echoed above the empty gray fog as his eyes rapidly turned dark and his eyelids drooped. In a fragmented dreamscape, he saw the spacious, elegant dining room where there was gilded porcelain cutlery, caviar, roasted chicken, lamb stew, fried ribeye steak, deep-fried dragonbone fish, thick creamy soup, and so on. The food was placed in a certain order according to specific requests in front of several diners. Among them was the slightly plump Capim, the middle-aged gentleman in a white hood, Horace, the thin-bloused Katie, and Parker, whose face was rather unintimidating due to his old age. Looking out from the end of the dining table, he could see a window decorated with gorgeous decorations. Outside the window, the clouds were sparse, and the crimson moon was faintly discernible in the air. Klein opened his eyes and marked the location of the moon in his dream. Using his knowledge in astromancy, he quickly calculated a rough corresponding time. It looks like it's from 7:30 to 7:45 in the evening. Considering those few scenes, Capim and the others have already finished more than half their meals, so I can push the time back by another 15 minutes. That way, 7:30 is the best choice. Klein muttered silently to himself as he interpreted the revelation from his dream divination. Eating at 7:30 was not a rare occurrence. This was even considered mainstream in the Lone Kingdom and even the northern continent because many middle-class people, either due to their personal situations or because of low rent, lived in the suburbs and had to commute to work by taking the short-distance steam locomotive. By the time they got home, it was usually after 7 in the evening, so it was normal for people to have dinner between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. Klein had had the same experience in Tingen City, but that was because he had no servants and no housewife. Once the three siblings returned home, they still needed to busy themselves for quite a while before they could enjoy any hot food. It wasn't because they lived far from work. This was why civilians and the poor often had dinner between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. As lunch and dinner were separated by quite some time, afternoon tea, which should have belonged to the upper-class citizens, became popular among the middle-class citizens and civilians. When he finished the interpretation, Klein recalled the revelation he had just received. Klein became acutely aware of a problem. Where were Capim's wife and children? They didn't appear in the dining room. Is Capim an extreme believer in the Lord of Storms, so his wife and children have to eat their meals in the activity room? Or is there another reason? Or could he be unmarried and childless? He's already a middle-aged man. Klein tried to divine the situation, but he failed to receive any effective revelations, so he gave up. 7:30. He repeated the time once more before returning to the real world. In the evening, even at home, Capim, who was wearing a formal bow tie, narrowed his eyes and looked at his subordinates before him. He asked in a slow but chilling voice, "Fabian is dead?" "Yes, boss." Even though he had been working with Capim for many years, his subordinates still felt fear and horror. "Odysseus, call me Mr. In a few years, you'll have to call me Sir Capim." Capim loosened his bow tie and casually handled a thick cigar. "When did Fabian die? How did he die?" "This afternoon, I sent him to East Borough to do something. He ended up in a conflict with the Zmanger gang and got stabbed in the neck," Odysseus described in a trembling voice. Capim, who was toasting the cigar, said in an unperturbed tone, "Fabian is really a fool. But are the Zmanger gang fools to not know that he's my subordinate? Mister, as you know, Highlanders often join the Zmanger gang when they arrive in East Borough, and they're barbaric and reckless, and they don't give a shit who's who," Odysseus quickly explained. Capim snorted. "Have they forgotten that this isn't the Highlands? Or have they forgotten who I am? Odysseus, I want the body of the Zmanger gang's leader from that block. Can you do it? If you can't, I'll sink your wife, your child, as well as you into the tussock river. Mister, no problem. Odysseus immediately raised his voice. He immediately asked in a low voice, "Who can I mobilize?" Capym was about to reply when the door suddenly opened and the middle-aged gentleman with a white wig, Horace, walked in. He gave Odysseus a cold glance before casting his gaze onto Capym. "I heard that one of your subordinates had a conflict with a gang in Eastborough and ended up dying?" "Yes, Mr. Horace." Capym stood up, cigar in hand. Horace stared into Capym's eyes and said, "You want revenge on them?" Capym's forehead suddenly dripped with beads of sweat. "No, not at all. Mr. Horace, you misunderstand." Horace nodded slightly. "You have to remember that during this critical period, we have to try our best to not cause any trouble unless necessary." He paused for a second and observed Capym's reaction. "You are not the only human trafficker in Backlund. We can support you, but we can also do so for others. You have to remember this point. The reason why I picked you was because you were vicious and shameless enough. However, you were extremely cautious. It wasn't because you were the biggest human trafficker." From the side, Odysseus listened to the duo's conversation. He wished that he was just a mass of air. That way, he didn't need to see how humble his boss, Capym, was. Without a trace of anger on his face, Capym smiled and said, "Mr. Horace, my main concern is that Fabian's death isn't simple. It might disrupt your plans." "No, there's nothing wrong with his death," Horace said in an affirmative tone. "I didn't get any feedback." "Is that so?" Capym acted enlightened. "Then I'm relieved." He looked at Odysseus and signaled him to leave. He then lowered his voice and said, "Mr. Horace, this time, there are the kind of goods you like from this batch." Seeing Horace's expression soften but not show any signs of emotion, Capym quickly added, "We've already finished gathering the ones that will be sent over." Horace nodded slowly. "Send her to my room tonight." "Yes, Mr. Horace," Capym said with a big smile. After Horace left, his face turned gloomy. He took a deep breath and whispered, "I hope that you can keep your promise this time. I don't want to be involved in anything like that anymore." He clearly remembered that year during the Harvest Festival, someone had come to him, hoping to get a batch of innocent girls. From that day on, the trajectory of his life had undergone tremendous changes. He had taken a fifth of the market share of the unlawful slave trade. He quickly became one of Backlund's rather famous tycoons, acquainting himself with several important figures and dragging them into the abyss of depravity. At this point, he desperately wanted to cover up the sins of his past. He wanted to let Capym undergo a catharsis, allowing him to become a true member of the upper class. However, for the time being, he was unable to do so. Glancing at the cigar in his hand, he picked up the framed photograph of himself with a beautiful woman and 2 children. Rubbing the surface of the photo frame with his thumb, Capym narrowed his eyes and whispered to himself, "After this deal, you should be able to return." At dinner time, Capym walked out of his study, a warm smile plastered over his face again. "Ma'am Katie, there's your favorite caviar and a roast chicken specially prepared for you this evening," he said to the woman in the thin blouse. Katie touched the old scar on her face and nodded without saying a word. Capym knew that she was silent and fierce, so he didn't continue. He watched her as she took her seat. Then Horace, wearing a white wig, entered the dining room, nodding slightly to each of the diners. The elderly Parker took a sip of his pre-meal wine, smiling as he motioned for Capym to sit down. The white napkins were spread out, and the food was served one by one. Capym raised his glass and chuckled. "Holy Lord of Storms, let's toast to a beautiful future." "To a beautiful future," Parker responded. Horace didn't say a word. He merely held the wine glass in his hand and made a gesture. Katie completely ignored them. At this moment, the classical clock hanging in the hall read 7:23. In a cheap hotel in the Backlund Bridge area. The disguised Klein took out his golden pocket watch, looked at the exact time, then he took out holy night powder, and he sealed the room with a wall of spirituality. After doing that, he quickly set up an altar and conducted a ritual. I summon in my name, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. When the ritual was over, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog, ready to respond to himself. Inside the towering and solemn palace, he saw the door of summoning condensed by rippling light. It was a pair of illusory doors that opened outwards, covered with mysterious symbols. Klein was in no hurry to be summoned. Instead, he took out the sun brooch and other mystical items, and he absorbed them into his spirit body according to his plan. Finally, he picked up the Dark Emperor card and let his spirit body envelop it. All of a sudden, Klein felt as if his spirit body had turned corporeal with flesh and blood. It was as if he could lift a gun and move a table and chair. A dark and ethereal mist rose up around him, and as the mist clung onto the surface of his body, it formed an imposing set of armor. He had a black crown on his head and a long cape of the same color on his back. At that moment, Klein was like an emperor about to embark on a journey. Dark Emperor. He examined the purifying bullets and revolver that he didn't bring with him before taking a step forward and entering the crack on the illusory door. Leaping out of the candlelight, he immediately flew under the cover of the night towards Capham's villa on Iris Street in Sherwood Borough. Not long after, he floated in front of the artificial fountain and approached the villa's entrance at a relaxed pace. The patrolling guards passed by him, but they didn't have any reaction. Since it wasn't really late into the night yet, there were no Beyonders on guard outside. In addition, Klein wasn't afraid that the powerful Beyonders inside would notice and have a premonition. It was because the Dark Emperor card possessed anti-divination and anti-prophecy characteristics. Chapter 378. The show begins with a black crown and a solid suit of armor. Klein stood in the doorway, attuned himself for a few seconds, and took a step forward. His seemingly physical body silently passed through the door and entered Capham's villa. The first thing that met him was a spacious hall with lots of chairs and clothes racks, and behind it was a magnificent hall with gold as the main color theme. There was no ceiling, only a dome reaching 3 stories high. A giant crystal chandelier hung down, and on each petal was a pearly white candle. Through a thick, heavy door to the left of the hall was an elegant and exquisite dining room. The fragrance of roasted meat was the richest inside, concealing the smell of alcohol and other food. Klein was in no hurry to enter the dining room. He partially circled the exterior first, occasionally reaching out his hand to pull on the grayish-white gas pipes. It appeared as if he was experimenting with his physical strength, after carrying the Dark Emperor card, to see how much of an impact he had on the real world. While he was a seer and clown, Klein's spirit body only had an intuition ability that was separate from divination. He possessed only 2 spell-like powers, which were to directly attack the soul and to freeze the target through contact. Once he advanced to the magician sequence, even if Klein didn't rely on the beyonder powers of his physical body, he could still use paper figurine substitutes and air bullets in his spirit body state. In addition, he began to be able to possess others and gain basic control of the target. Augmented by the Dark Emperor card, the strength of his spirit body increased, and the number of items he could carry increased. His spell-like powers, which could directly attack souls, evolved into a specter's shriek. It produced sound waves that were inaudible to humans but capable of damaging the souls of all living beings in the area. Similarly, the frozen effects derived from contact was clearly strengthened. After confirming everything, he found the corner of a wall and penetrated it to enter the dining hall. Then, suppressing all his emotions, he swept his eyes across the long table. The scene of Horace in his white wig, Katie in her thin blouse, Parker with his aged face drinking red wine, and the slightly plump Capham slicing his ribeye steak caught his eye. Klein retracted his gaze quickly, not daring to look too much, lest the few Beyonders would discover him via their spiritual perception. With the help of the spiritual glows from the male and female servants standing around him, that is, the color of their auras, he carefully circled around the dining room and figured out the exact layout. For example, the size of the dining room was equivalent to the total area of his living room, dining room, and activity room. Another example was that there was a fireplace that burned with charcoal. It warmed the entire room via a pipe. There were 16 elegant gas lamps, and their lighting mixed together, making the room appear like it was daytime. Across from the fireplace was a wall which had hanging picture frames. There were sketches and oil paintings, all works of famous artists. That bearded Belize isn't here. He should be changing shifts at the basement. For a beyonder to be willing to do such menial work, Capem is definitely not involved in a simple matter of human trafficking. Klein thought for a few seconds, then he leaned against an oil painting of the sunset. He reached his hand into his body and unscrewed a translucent brown bottle's cap. It was the biological poison bottle. The reason why he paid so much attention to the time and chose to arrive at dinner time was because, at this very moment, the main figures were gathered here in the most orderly manner. It was the most advantageous for him to use the biological poison bottle. And with the tightly shut doors and windows during early winter, it allowed the effects of biological poison bottle to be more effective and have faster effects. In addition, Klein didn't soak the biological poison bottle to concoct the prophylactic drug before he came. He was currently in his spirit body state, so he wasn't afraid of biological poisons. With his spirit body's concealment and containment, he stood there silently and patiently admiring each and every one of the elegant wall lamps which were connected to the grayish-white gas pipes. Quickly, the odorless poison swiftly emanated outwards. Horace, with his white wig, sliced up a deep-fried dragon-bone fish, dipped it in black pepper sauce, and stuffed it into his mouth. Chewing and swallowing, he picked up the faintly golden champagne that was bubbling like a string of beads and took a sip in a good mood. He couldn't help but think of the entertainment that he would be experiencing that evening, the joy of a stubborn girl being conquered by him. This affected his appetite and made him unable to concentrate. Katie didn't get the servant to help her slice the roasted chicken. She was burying her head, holding a knife and fork, and like doing a precise dissection, she quickly divided the chicken into several pieces. They were all almost the same size. As Parker sampled the red wine and ate the stewed lamb, he would occasionally chat with Capem, who was sitting at the head of the table and was considered as a guest that didn't sully the title. The dinner proceeded in an orderly manner, and finally, Capem put the last piece of beef into his mouth. He smiled at the three beyonders and said, "Mr. Horace, Ma'am Katie, and Mr. Parker, tonight's desserts are from La Barrega's head chef. There are 3 kinds: fruit caramel pudding, cream shortcake, and the carrot cake." Horace, who had always been cold, nodded slightly. "We love dessert so much in this country." As soon as he finished his reflection, he saw Capem raise his hand and scratch his cheek before scratching again. "It's a little itchy." Capem smiled apologetically. Before he could finish his sentence, he couldn't help but scratch one more time, leaving a clear bloody mark on his face. The bloody mark quickly swelled up, and his skin turned translucent. One could even see yellowish pus inside. "It's really a bit itchy." Capem smiled again. He scratched the original spot again, but due to using excessive force, the swelling caused the translucent skin to split open, and pus with a nauseating smell sprayed out. Horace narrowed his eyes and shot to his feet, looking around warily. "Ha ha, ha, ha." At that moment, he heard exaggerated laughter, and his body suddenly tensed up. He saw a male and female servant holding onto their bellies, laughing out loud. They laughed so much that they couldn't even straighten their backs. Tears flowed out from their laughter. Their laughter caused the room to turn completely silent. Like a chain reaction, the rest of the servants fainted or vomited yellow-green liquid continuously without end. None of them were spared. Bam! Katie flipped the dining table, letting the gold-plated cutlery and leftover food and wine to spill onto the floor. She had a revolver and a soft black whip in her hands. Parker stood up as well, but his mind appeared adrift. He looked at Capem crying miserably for help as he kept scratching and forcefully tore off a few pieces of flesh. For some baffling reason, he felt that the other party's ugly and disgusting appearance was quite the fine sight. At that moment, Horace realized that he was a little out of breath and realized that the room was probably filled with poison. He growled, "Hold your breath. Parker, open the door. Katie, follow me to find the intruder." At this moment, Horace was grateful that the dinner had been enjoyed with Capem, and there were quite a few attendants around. These ordinary people's ability to resist poison was far inferior to Beyonders. The fact that they showed signs ahead of time had allowed them to detect that something was amiss even before the poison had reached the deepest part of their bodies. Parker, who has the lowest sequence, should be the one with the most severe symptoms among us. Horace suddenly had this thought. As Parker opened the door to ensure that the dining room was no longer sealed, Horace, relying on his spirit vision, discovered an illusory figure quietly fleeting around. The figure wore a thick and imposing black armor and a pitch-black crown on his head. A mask of the same color covered his face, making him look like a king from the spirit world. It was none other than Klein. Horace raised his right hand and pointed at the black figure that couldn't be seen by ordinary people. He chanted in ancient Hermes, "Imprison!" All of a sudden, the black figure's surroundings turned viscous, as though it had transformed into a giant amber or produced a sealed, transparent wall. The figure was rooted to the spot, hardly able to move. Katie had taken aim long ago, and she pulled the trigger. They worked well together. With two bangs, the light golden bullet, filled with strange patterns, penetrated the viscous air and hit the black figure. The bullet pierced through and struck the wall opposite. The black shadow self-ignited, reduced to a roughly cut paper figurine. Within the pale golden flames, the paper figurine was quickly reduced to ashes. But, with a strange, crisp snap, the light from the 16 elegant gas lamps and the fire burning quietly in the fireplace suddenly lit up, leaving Horace, Katie, and Parker with only a brief flash of red before their eyes. Soon after, all the flames were extinguished, leaving the dining room illuminated via the human-height street lamps outside the window and the crimson moonlight shining through the layers of clouds. It made the place abnormally dark and silent. Horace and the others once again relied on their spirit vision and spiritual perception to search for the ghostly intruder. At the same time, he realized that the poison wasn't showing its effects fast enough. It wouldn't really flare up until he finished the enemy. Therefore, he paid attention to the movement at the entrance of the basement. He pointed at the door again and said in ancient Hermes, "Confinement." The entire dining room suddenly froze, as if there was an additional layer of an invisible wall that even spirit bodies couldn't penetrate. Horace wanted to make it impossible for the intruder to escape. "I found you." Wielding the revolver in one hand and the whip in the other, Katie noticed a black figure floating in the air. A strange light flashed in her eyes, and before she could attack, her mind buzzed as if someone had struck her head with a wooden stick. She felt as if she had encountered an indescribable shriek. A few drops of sticky blood slowly dripped from the tip of her nose. Horace only felt slight dizziness while the symptoms of shortness of breath seemed to worsen. Parker, the weakest of them, was seeing stars, and his steps became unstable. Suddenly, someone patted Parker's shoulder. A cold and gloomy feeling gushed over, causing him to freeze on the spot. It was as if he was completely covered in ice, and the cold moisture seeped into his bones. A familiar, deep voice sounded in his ears. "Imprison." Parker was instantly trapped by the transparent wall that imprisoned the door. However, Klein didn't possess him and went straight through instead, avoiding the effects of Horace's spell in a timely manner. Horace narrowed his eyes and waved his right hand. "Release." Chapter 379, Magic's Key segment. The invisible prison around Parker's body immediately collapsed, leaving not even a single trace of it behind. However, he didn't regain his mobility. Instead, he slumped to the ground, shivering continuously, as if he was still frozen. This wasn't only an aftereffect of soul touch, but also the effect of Klein's direct attack on his soul. Parker, who was only a sequence 8, was unable to recover in a short period of time. He couldn't even control his breathing and, as a result, inhaled large quantities of the biological poison, which was identical to the one in his body, once again. His weakened state caused the poison in his body to act faster. His eyes stared blankly as he instinctively changed direction. He saw Capim rolling on the ground and scratching his face and body constantly. He saw the thin strips of flesh hanging by the side of the wounds and the ghostly white color of his bones. Parker gasped and struggled to climb over. Capim, whose itch made him rip off the outer layer of his skin, suddenly discovered that Parker was crawling toward him with bloodshot eyes. He had a bad premonition, but he had no strength to dodge as he couldn't stop scratching. He didn't even have the ability to shout, "No," except for using a blood-curdling cry as a substitute. At this moment, Klein, who had dodged the imprison spell, shouted, "Holy," in ancient Hermes. Then he rubbed his fingers together and shot an air bullet through the dark golden sunbird brooch's coruscating glow. As soon as the air bullet was formed, it took on a holy luster and shot straight towards Horace's face. This was the holy oath provided by the sun brooch, and Klein had augmented the air bullet with holy damage. Horace had long since changed his position. He was abnormally agile, and unlike a mage, he was more like a pugilist expert. As he avoided Klein's air bullet, he motioned for Katie to lash her whip to hold Klein back. When Klein's attack was interrupted, Horace took an iron-black metal glove from a hidden pocket of his and tried to put it on his left hand. In his spirit body state, Klein didn't need to look out from the corner of his eye to see what had just happened despite not facing Horace. He immediately flew up, avoiding Katie's lash. He flew over the chandelier and pounced towards Horace. When Horace saw the scene, he held the black metal glove and pointed diagonally upwards. Exile! Klein was suddenly hit by an overwhelming and invisible force. His entire spirit body was blown away by the wind and hit the wall conjured by confinement, but didn't penetrate through it and escape. Seizing this opportunity, Horace put on the iron-black metal glove. In the blink of an eye, he seemed to grow a bit taller. His authority was uplifted like he was a figure that could determine the life and death of others. The moment Klein was released from the exile state, he felt an inexplicable sense of horror. He couldn't help but want to lower his head, to prostrate, to listen to Horace's every word and obey every order given by him. His movements had become sluggish, and his pupils reflected a rapidly approaching Katie. Katie lashed out with her long black whip and hit Klein accurately. The long whip passed through his spirit body, but it brought a great deal of pain to Klein's psyche, as if someone had pressed a red-hot iron to the weakest part of his body. He jerked his head up and let out a scream. As for Katie, she pulled the trigger of the revolver in her other hand. Bang! Bang! 2 bullets, with a light golden glow, shot out one after another, striking Klein's body. Bright rays of light bloomed, and the figure wearing black armor rapidly thinned, turning into a paper figurine and quickly burning into ashes. Klein appeared in a dark corner. The sun brooch inside his spirit body was glowing with a dark golden light. Warm powers instantly filled his body, and the extreme horror that Horace had subjected him to quickly disappeared. One of the spell-like effects of the sun brooch was horror immunity. In the short span of less than a minute, Klein had already been forced to use paper figurine substitutes twice. Although it was partly because he did it on purpose, it was still enough to prove the strength of Horace and Katie's joint attacks. It was enough to confirm the divination outcome which Klein had received. This operation would be quite dangerous. If Parker hadn't been temporarily crippled by the effects of the biological poison bottle and his initial surprise attack, the situation would have been even more dangerous. His plan was to rationally give up if all 4 paper figurines were used up and his opportunity had yet to appear. It wasn't because Klein didn't wish to prepare more substitutes, but because his spirituality could only afford 4 times while in combat. As for the confinement effect that Horace had created, Klein wasn't worried at all. He was now a spirit body that had been summoned. As long as he ended the summoning, he would immediately return above the gray fog. Unless it was intercepted by powers at the level of deities or the special effects of sealed artifacts at grade 0 or grade 1, nothing could interrupt this process. Previously, when Klein went to the Royal Museum to steal the Dark Emperor card, the woman who was suspected of being a high-sequence beyonder was unable to stop him from leaving. This was the main reason why Klein dared to challenge the impossible even though he knew that the danger was great. Seeing that the enemy was no longer horrified, Horace put on his black metal gloves and signaled Katie to hold Klein back. He then pointed forward and solemnly said, "Specters and wraiths are prohibited here." Klein's body that was covered in black armor immediately trembled as he was strongly repelled by a powerful, invisible force. However, the level of the Dark Emperor card was extremely high, causing the level of the spirit body to be relatively high as well. This kind of influence that was directly aimed at a particular existence was quickly suppressed. Horace narrowed his eyes, feeling that the intruding specter was very strange. He saw that Klein easily escaped Katie's intervention via flight, so he pushed his palm forward again and announced in ancient Hermes, "Flying and floating are prohibited here." All of a sudden, Klein felt his body become heavy, and he plummeted from midair to the ground. Katie quickly rushed over, and with a flick of her wrist, she lashed out with the whip that directed torture on the mind and soul. She still had many Beyonder bullets on her, but there were fewer than 3 that were targeted for specters and wraiths. Therefore, she temporarily gave up on using the revolver and only relied on her auxiliary weapon. Klein rolled on the ground, skillfully dodging Katie's whip. He heard the crack of the whip as it hit the ground. Katie was about to sweep the whip when she felt an itch at her throat. She coughed twice and missed the opportunity to continue her relentless attack. This was a sign of the poison acting up. Horace took a deep breath, held his breath once more. He folded his wrist, pointed to himself, and said, "Disciplinary target, wraiths and specters." The surface of his body immediately emitted a light as bright as the morning sun. Even his fist began to shine with lustrous brilliances. Bam! The marble under Horace's feet cracked soundlessly, and his tall, thin body pounced swiftly and fiercely, allowing him to immediately close in on Klein. At this moment, he looked even more like a knight than Katie. Bam! He threw a punch forward, and the air seemed to explode. However, Klein had pulled back ahead of time, dodging the punch with the wind. Pow! Katie helped from the side and lashed out with her whip in the direction in which her enemy was dodging. This forced Klein to have no choice but to roll again and again. He took on a fighting stance while keeping an eye out for Horace's spell-like imprison. As lashing sounds echoed, Horace kept attacking while Katie aided him from the side. In less than 2 minutes, Klein was forced into an unavoidable situation. Even rolling was of no use. Katie's black whip lashed out at Klein's face, and he was only able to take 1 step sideways before being hit in the arm. That piercing pain attacked his psyche once again, causing him to freeze on the spot. Even his spirit body became somewhat thinner. Seizing this opportunity, Horace clenched his left fist and solemnly declared, "Death." His body then merged with some sort of strange force, creating an obvious afterimage as he slammed into Klein. Schwing! The figure covered in black armor instantly broke into pieces, turning into pieces of paper that fluttered in the air like a butterfly. Klein had expended his 3rd paper figurine. Horace's gaze swept across the room and quickly locked onto the enemy that had appeared in the corner. He sneered and said, "Let me see how many substitutes you have left." In the process of searching for the enemy, he discovered that Parker was squirming on top of Capum. The scene was bloody and disgusting. It was a repulsive sight, both terrible and horrifying. However, Horace didn't have the luxury of time to save his subordinate. He was well aware that the effects of the poison would only worsen over time, so he had to get rid of the enemy as quickly as possible, so he couldn't be distracted. If he didn't, he would have to leave the dining hall first to recover from the poison, thus allowing the enemy to escape without getting any useful information. He signaled Katie to go forward again, so as to hold back Klein, who couldn't fly or float. He took a breath and tried to catch a breather. There's a strange smell in the air. This is probably a result of the increasing toxicity of the poison. This thought flashed through Horace's mind, but he didn't think too much about it. He raised his left hand and solemnly declared, "The illegal intrusion of another's house is a crime." An illegal intrusion. While repeating the statement for a second time, Horace found it hard to breathe again. For a moment, he was unable to catch his breath, so he could only stop midway. He took another deep breath, adjusted himself, and spoke again. "The illegal intrusion of another's house is a crime." He repeated it 3 times, and Klein, who was still unable to extricate himself from Katie's entanglement, felt a baffling chill. Katie showed coughing symptoms again, and the flailing of her whip became sluggish. Klein took the opportunity to stop the embroilment with her, but he didn't attack her. Instead, he raised his head, opened his mouth, and let out a sharp cry that no human could hear. Katie's head jerked up, and her body swayed. She felt like the ground was bobbing up and down. Horace only felt a slight dizziness before returning to normal. He looked at Klein coldly and said in a majestic voice, "The guilty should be restricted." Klein, who was lunging at him, found to his surprise that his feet had seemed to be immobilized by invisible shackles. It made his movements suddenly turn rigid. Katie, who had recovered a little, swung open the revolver's cylinder and quickly removed the spent and unused rounds. Then, she took out a quick reloading device and stuffed 6 rounds of ammunition, including her remaining purifying bullets, into the cylinder. Horace clenched his left fist and prepared for an attack. He wanted to chain his attack with Katie's shooting, in a bid to completely finish the enemy or to expend his substitutes. At this moment, the black-armored Klein smiled. It was because the opportunity he had been waiting for had come. He knew that it would take time for the biological poison bottle to show any significant effects. And once Beyonders sensed that something was wrong, they would act accordingly, either to find the hidden enemy or to escape the toxic environment. It would be difficult to seriously damage them or even finish them. Therefore, he had 2 other reasons for using the biological poison bottle. The first reason was to weaken the enemy. The second reason was to mask some smells so that Horace and the others would attribute all the abnormal smells they detected to the poison in the air. It made them focus all their attention on this aspect. This was the most important segment of a magic show, and also the key to success or failure. That abnormal smell was the smell of gas. The reason why Klein let the gas lamp and the fire in the fireplace suddenly brighten and extinguish wasn't solely to affect Horace and company's vision. It was mainly to attract their attention, so that he could destroy a few hidden gas pipes. In the beginning, he had intentionally put himself in danger in order to trick Katie into firing a bullet meant for wraiths and specters, so that she would no longer blindly fire at him and not trigger a corresponding explosion. He kept entangling himself with her and hadn't made any other attempts solely because he was waiting for the air to be filled with gas. Therefore, he kept holding back from using flaming jump or flame controlling. As for Horace's actions of using confinement on the room, he had expected it, but he didn't expect it to be this successful. Therefore, before he entered the dining room, he had kindly inspected the doors and windows to see if they were airtight. He had destroyed the hidden gas pipes in the hall, causing the area, both inside and outside, to become a huge bomb. Even without confinement, it would ultimately not affect anything. As a specter, Klein was undoubtedly unafraid of explosions. Lower-level ghosts might be annihilated by fire, but specters would at most suffer some damage. This was why Klein had to buy extra purifying bullets and the sun brooch despite the fact that he had flame controlling. When he saw that Katie had raised her revolver and was about to shoot, and that Horace was about to pronounce death on him, Klein smiled and snapped his fingers. Horace suddenly felt a dangerous foreboding. However, at this moment, he saw that a flame had already lit up in the fireplace to his side, instantly igniting the surrounding air. Boom! With a loud boom, Horace's vision was instantly filled with an inferno that filled the room. It was as if he was watching a grand display of fireworks. Chapter 380. Curtain Call Capim lay flat on the ground, itching and aching, wishing he could tear himself apart on the spot to rid himself of this hellish pain. Then he saw a scarlet wave of fire that spread over in a flash, and he heard a deafening explosion. He imagined that this last moment would seem infinitely long and that it would allow him to recall all of the beautiful scenes when his wife and children were still by his side. He thought that he would feel relieved because he would no longer have to endure this inhuman torture, but at that moment, extreme fear and an intense desire to live surged from the bottom of his heart. And the so-called memories didn't even flash past his mind before he was overwhelmed by an excruciating pain before being plunged into deep darkness. Boom! The dining room windows were blasted apart, accompanied by countless brick fragments and rubble, as well as the burning tongues of fire that kept reaching outwards. The guards patrolling this area were immediately knocked over. Those who were lucky enough to not get hit had their ears left ringing. Their bodies either swayed, staggered, or fell. They saw that more than half of the dining room's outer wall had collapsed and that the flames seemed to be floating in midair. The residents of the entire street and the police officers in charge of the surrounding area heard a loud boom at the same time, leaving them confused and frightened. In the dining room, dressed in black armor and a black crown, Klein stood there, bathing in the red flames and enjoying the strong blasts of the waves without flinching. A lot of the black gases around him had dispersed, and even his spirit body had suffered some damage, but it wasn't serious at all. Beside a toppled table, Parker and Capim were blasted into a corner, their heads were cracking and their bodies charred. The surface of their bodies was still quietly burning with flames, and the rest of the servants were in a similar state. In the area opposite the fireplace, Katie, who had been unable to avoid the attack in time, was slammed into the wall and then fell to the ground. Her body was mangled and covered in blood, and there were a lot of charred marks on her skin. Not a single piece of her skin remained intact. She wasn't dead yet, but she had fainted from her severe injuries. Even so, she still coughed while convulsing, inhaling large amounts of the lingering flames. The black whip also suffered similar damage. Many cracks appeared on its surface, and a small portion of the whip was ignited. None of the Beyonder bullets that she possessed were spared from the explosion. Katie was no longer capable of fighting. Horace had rolled in time to protect his vitals, but there was still a lot of blood and charred flesh on him. He staggered to his feet, revealing that his back, his hairband, and his legs were ablaze with red flames. His breathing became more difficult, and his body suffered relatively severe injuries. However, this was sufficient to prove the robustness and strength of his body. Or rather, having worn the black iron glove, his body became sufficiently robust, and his physique was sufficiently strong. However, this was within Klein's expectations. Since he was unable to assess how much damage his opponent could take, he had overestimated his enemy's constitution while coming up with a plan. Out of the corner of his eye, Horace saw that Klein was almost perfectly fine. His pupils shrank as he hurriedly stretched out his left hand and pointed in that direction. He said in a low voice, "Exile." Again, Klein failed to resist and was pushed away like scrap paper in a hurricane. He flew out of the dining room. In the hall outside, after the momentary ignition, the fire had already weakened. Another wave of disaster was brewing due to the wooden staircase, but the damage here wasn't too severe because the main body of the explosion had been confined to the dining room. Seizing this opportunity, Horace suddenly turned around and ran outside without looking back. Even though the flames covering his body were still burning, he didn't waste any time to deal with them. He knew that he was in a terrible condition and on the brink of losing control. Furthermore, the effects of the poison would soon reach its peak. Compounded by these two factors, he didn't think that he had any chance of defeating the intruder. It would be the same even if he had the help of the Sequence 7, Belize, at the entrance to the basement. Horace believed that if this battle continued, the only thing that awaited him was having the poison act up or him losing control due to his injuries. Once he decided to run, he didn't care about Katie, who was still alive, anymore. When Klein, who had just stabilized his body under exile, saw this scene, he immediately raised his head, opened his mouth, and let out a shriek that no human could hear. Horace felt a wave of dizziness, and his feet paused for a moment. His skin, which was still in relatively good condition, was now covered in dense, translucent blisters. This was an early sign of him losing control. However, he quickly recovered and continued his mad dash, escaping from the lawn of the villa. He's really hard to kill. Klein didn't pursue him in order to avoid an accident. He remembered that his goal was to rescue the victims and not to wipe away these degenerate Beyonders. More importantly, he had expended a lot of his energy and had suffered heavy injuries. If he were to give chase, he might not be able to stop Horace's berserk counterattack. But Klein snapped his fingers and fired an air bullet. The bullet struck Katie in the head, ending her pain. Immediately following that, Klein turned around and flew towards the entrance to the basement. Belize, who had a full beard, had been keeping an eye on the situation outside, but he didn't dare to leave his post out of fear that the intruder's accomplices would take the opportunity to break into the dungeon. At this very moment, he held a high-pressure steam rifle and had his spirit vision activated. He had been frightened by the loud boom and became abnormally tense. Immediately afterwards, he saw the dignified specter fly over, and without hesitation, he raised his rifle and pulled the trigger. Bang! White mist was ejected from the barrel, and a sharp-tipped pale gold bullet was shot forward at an astonishing speed. Klein was prepared and Long had a hunch. He had drawn out a small curve before Belize fired. The bullet tore through the hall, past the front door, and to the outside. At the same time, Belize rushed out of the duty room, holding his high-pressure steam rifle, and took on a threatening pose as he quickly moved towards the door. He believed that the intruder, who could deal with Horace, Katie, and Parker, would be able to easily kill him as well. Besides, such a big commotion must have attracted a lot of attention. He couldn't be certain that the mandated punishers would come over to investigate. Therefore, his only choice was to flee. Klein once again let out an invisible shriek, making Belize feel as if he had been smashed by a hammer. He saw stars as a few drops of blood dripped from the tip of his nose. But this didn't stop Belize from running. After shooting at Klein to stop him, he was already running into the hall, tumbling towards the door. Klein hesitated for a moment, then he gave up on chasing and fighting. He turned off the main valve, went to the entrance of the basement, and snapped his fingers repeatedly. Bang, bang, bang. Air bullets shot at the invisible walls, gradually disintegrating the confinement. This was also one of the reasons why Klein dared to cause a gas explosion and use the biological poison bottle. With the effects of Horace's confinement in the underground dungeon, as long as it wasn't a frontal assault, he didn't have to worry about accidentally harming those pitiful girls. He destroyed the locks and flew into the dungeon, first finding the cell where Daisy had been held based on the revelation from his prior divination scenes. He then confirmed that she wasn't hurt too badly and was still able to move. Then, his body turned illusory and melted into the metal door. Frick, frick, frick. The iron doors on one side opened quickly, one after another, as though an invisible specter was running to unlock them. Frick, frick, frick. After one side was done, he did it for the other side. Daisy and the other girls were frightened by the explosion outside. After a while, she was surprised to find that the door to her cell was open for some baffling reason. Yet, no one entered. It felt like she could leave at any time. Some of the girls, who hadn't been disciplined at all since they were recently kidnapped, mustered their courage, got up, and attempted to run to the exit of the basement. They passed through the hall, which was slightly damaged by the explosion, and they left the burning villa's worsening condition, running faster and faster in the direction of freedom. When they reached the street, Daisy and the other girls thought to look back. Looking back, they could just barely make out an imposing figure standing upright on top of the evil building. It was clad in full black armor, and it wore a black crown. The cape behind the figure began to flutter silently. As they remembered the scene, they sought a nearby cathedral with their mistrust towards the police. When Klein returned to the smoky and burning dining room, he found that Parker's and Katie's Beyonder characteristics had just begun to show signs of appearing. He checked the items they were carrying and confirmed that most of them had been destroyed. Even their money was charred to a crisp. Klein jumped up to the second and third floor, quickly checking for any relevant clues. He didn't attempt to use mediumship, because he was short on time. And bringing them above the gray fog didn't meet the requirements of his curtain call. If even a minor leader was made to maintain secrecy, then these important figures would definitely have their own restrictions. They aren't good candidates for performing mediumship as I please. Furthermore, the previous series of required actions is too troublesome, complicated, and inappropriate for the current situation that I'm in. Klein ended his investigation with nothing to show for, but he picked up a deck of tarot cards. Returning to the destroyed, charred dining room, he took out all the major arcana cards from the tarot card deck and walked over to Capham's corpse. Then he specially took 2 of them and scattered the rest over Capham's body. When this was done, he covered Capham's eyes with the 2 tarot cards he had specially drawn. They were face up with their main side. By this time, Parker's and Katie's Beyonder characteristics had appeared. Tens of seconds later, an illusory door covered with complicated symbols appeared in midair outside the villa. The door opened without a sound, and from it, a handsome man in a crisp suit walked out. He looked to be in his 40s, mature and elegant. He had a pair of golden eyes, and with just one sweep of his face, he locked onto the dining room in the midst of the fire. At this moment, a strong gust of wind blew past, and a figure flew over at high speeds. It was an old man wearing a soft hat. His silver eyes had an abnormal seriousness to them. He was wearing a black robe with the symbol of the Lord of Storms embroidered on it. It was none other than the Cardinal of the Church of the Lord of Storms, the Archbishop of Backlund, Spellsinger of God, Ace Snake. "Why are you here?" Ace asked in a deep voice. Any Beyonder-related matters in Sherwood Borough came under the jurisdiction of the Holy Wind Cathedral, so he was entitled to ask. The handsome man's expression turned slightly nasty as he replied, "I live nearby." They were close to the West Borough. The 2 of them didn't speak any further. They landed on the ground at the same time and entered the explosion site. A violent hurricane churned and swept away the flames, sending them to the artificial fountain outside. The wind seemed to have a life and intelligence of its own. The 2 demigod figures then saw Katie, whose head was shot and her flesh charred black, and Parker, who was entangled with someone else while his head had caved in and cracked. They also saw Capham, who was covered in tarot cards, as well as the 2 major arcana cards on the face of the human trafficker. These were the Judgment card, which depicted an angel blowing a great trumpet, and the Emperor card, which was decked out in armor and was crowned. Almost at the same time, Cardinal Snake and the handsome man sensed something and turned their heads to look outside. They discovered a majestic figure in black armor and a black crown located at the top of the house by the side of the villa. The figure nodded slightly, and his cape was lifted. Then, without any warning, he disappeared, right under the noses of the 2 high-sequence Beyonders. Chapter 381. Conjectures with a crackle, branched lightning lit up the early winter night with a silvery white flash. It didn't smite the ground, but instead, it tore through the air, illuminating the spot where Klein stood, as if it was daytime, making him stand out. Spellsinger of God, Ace Snake, retracted his gaze. His face was gloomy as he whispered, "Rose School of Thought? It's not a wraith, nor is it an undead creature." The mature middle-aged man with a pair of golden eyes turned his head to the side to look at Capham's corpse and said, covering the target's corpse with tarot cards, "This is the second time something like this has happened in the past 2 months." "When was the first instance?" Cardinal Snake asked in a deep voice. The mature middle-aged man in the well-ironed formal suit coughed lightly and said, "The time when the true creator attempted to descend into this world with the help of a swindler." "Then it's not the Rose School of Thought." Cardinal Snake made a definite judgment. Although those organizations that worshipped evil gods weren't fond of anyone, they wouldn't deliberately foil the plans of their counterparts. Instead, they wished to see their counterparts succeed, waiting for them to make a mess of the situation. "I think so too. Perhaps it's the appearance of a new secret organization. Their characteristic feature is to scatter tarot cards all over the target's body." The middle-aged man smiled. "And the different appearance of the tarot cards imply different meanings. This corpse has 2 cards over his face. One is Judgment, and the other is the Emperor. Judgment is the motive and goal, while the Emperor is the organization's code name. Of course, this might also be a type of ritual." Cardinal Snake didn't respond as he surveyed the area. "Let's see what exactly happened here." It was only at this point in time that the first batch of mandated punishers arrived at Capham's villa. Above the gray fog, having only used paper figurine substitutes thrice and not being pushed to his limits, Klein was about to use divination to confirm Daisy's safety afterward. Daisy will successfully return home. Holding the spirit pendulum in his left hand, he closed his eyes and silently chanted the sentence. After repeating it 7 times, Klein opened his eyes and saw the topaz pendant turning counterclockwise, but it moved with a very slow frequency and a tiny amplitude. This means that Daisy's journey home will be quite a bumpy one but almost negligible. After interpreting the revelation, Klein was relieved of his final concerns. He then looked at the two items in front of him, both of which were radiating with a strong spiritual luster. One of them was a light blue, translucent hexagonal pillar. There were traces of light flashing through it, as though it was lightning that came from the depths of one's consciousness. This was the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Ma'am Katie. The other belonged to Parker, who hadn't been able to play a role in the battle. His Beyonder characteristic had condensed into a ball, like a child's fist. This fist was made up of 3 colors, iron black and dark red colors intertwined with a large swath of silver. Klein didn't hesitate to conjure a pen and paper. He was ready to use these 2 Beyonder characteristics to divine the corresponding potion formulas. Before he advanced to Sequence 7, because of the additional influences that had been left on the Beyonder characteristics he had, it was almost impossible to use divination to determine the formulas. Even if this mysterious space could help him eliminate the interference and increase his divination ability to a certain extent, it still wasn't enough. Therefore, the only method Klein could use in the past was mediumship. After he became a magician, he was preliminarily able to determine it using the Beyonder characteristic for a divination above the gray fog. However, there was a high probability of him failing. This time, without exception, Klein had shamelessly failed. However, he also had some gains, and that was to be able to find out the corresponding sequence names of the 2 Beyonder characteristics. Parker is a Sequence 8 Sheriff and Katie is a Sequence 7 Interrogator. Aren't these from the Arbiter pathway? This pathway is controlled by the royal family, the military, and a small number of ancient aristocratic families in Lone. Any leaks of formulas and Beyonder ingredients are dealt with harshly. Could a number of the girls abducted by Capim be sent to the estate of some aristocrat? But there's no need for them to send 4 Beyonders to help Capim just to enjoy themselves. It obviously doesn't make sense. Horace is much more powerful than Katie, so perhaps he's a Sequence 6 of this pathway. After wearing that glove, he might even be as strong as a Sequence 5. Could it be that they're involved in some bloody heretic sacrifice, and the target they seek cannot be exposed? Apart from those on the inside of the kingdom, Fainapotter's Castilla family also possesses this Beyonder pathway, which is then transmitted to their army and intelligence system. Could this be another espionage case of some unknown nature? Klein tried to divine a few of his conjectures, but he failed again. He temporarily put this matter to the back of his mind and lightly tapped the edge of the long bronze table as he muttered to himself, "As long as I have the formula, with the corresponding supplementary ingredients, these 2 Beyonder characteristics will be able to turn a person into a Sequence 8 Sheriff and Sequence 7 Interrogator." Miss Magician's friend who's called Zio seems to be lacking the Beyonder ingredients for Sheriff. I can sell Parker's Beyonder characteristic to Miss Magician through the world so that I can quickly amass the money needed for the ingredients of the Faceless Sequence Potion. However, always doing it through the world doesn't seem rather appropriate. I deliberately left the tarot cards this time. If Miss Justice were to hear of this matter, then she would definitely believe that it was done by my adorer. I'll let Mr. Fool do the selling on his behalf. Klein quickly finalized a plan and made the Sheriff and Interrogator Beyonder characteristics fly to the corner and hid it among the junk pile. I wonder what the names are for the Arbiter Pathways Sequence 6 and 5. It seems like something that uses order and laws. Judge? Klein put away those thoughts and closed his eyes midway to carefully observe his current state. Once again, he felt his spirituality become lively as the potion stirred. He felt that his digestion of the potion had sped up. This time, he had confidence, based on his intuition, that he had concluded most of the magician rules. The remaining minutiae were good to have, but it didn't really matter if he lacked them. It didn't significantly affect his digestion process. Conjuring a fountain pen and goatskin, Klein enhanced his memory by writing the magician's rules. 1. Never perform unprepared. 2. Challenge the impossible, even if the final outcome is nothing but an illusion. Klein believed that these were the two core tenets of the magician's rules. Grasping them would be key, and the rest were supplementary for perfection. 3. Take the initiative to perform. 4. Try to get applause from the audience. 5. Wield control of the target's attention. Putting down the dark red fountain pen, Klein skimmed through it and judged them by himself. Daily acting, together with 3 or 4 proactive acting instances, would be enough to allow me to digest the magician potion before New Year's. If I were to challenge an impossible performance during this period, then my progress would be even faster. This is roughly at the speed I wish to achieve. There were still about 2 months till January 1st, 1350. After doing all this, Klein rubbed his temples, prepared to return to the real world. After putting away the Dark Emperor card, the biological poison bottle, and other items, he suddenly laughed and said self-deprecatingly, "Challenge the impossible. Isn't that equivalent to courting death?" As his voice echoed, Klein's figure disappeared from the space above the gray fog. In the cheap hotel in the Backlund Bridge area, he suddenly opened his eyes and saw the candlelight of his summoning ritual. After quickly clearing up everything, Klein put on a thick worker's jacket he'd bought for 4 soldi and went to the window. He picked up the sweet iced tea that he had bought earlier and looked at his blurry figure, which was reflected in the window. There was a heartfelt smile on his face as he whispered, "Cheers." Just as he finished his sentence, he touched the glass with his cup, then lifted his chin and downed it in one gulp. Then he sauntered out of the hotel. The nearby gas lamps were already fully lit up, and pedestrians and carts were bustling about, oblivious to the explosion at the border between the Sherwood Borough and West Borough. Klein strolled around the Bravehearts bar for a while, and at 7:58, he knocked on the door of the Beyonder gathering organized by Eye of Wisdom. He wore an iron mask and a hooded robe, acting completely ordinary. Meanwhile, Zio, who went to various places every night to check on her contacts, saw a sign that had never appeared before. It belonged to the golden-masked man who had sold the sheriff's formula to her at the gathering organized by Mr. A. It was the sign of an emergency meeting. "He hasn't come looking for me all this time, and I've been pretending that it had never happened. Why would he suddenly?" Zio thought for a moment before deciding to take a look. The golden-masked man had promised to give her some missions, allowing her to save enough money and exchange it for the corresponding Beyonder ingredients. Therefore, Zio switched areas and marked the time and place of the meeting. Half an hour later, Zio walked out of her hiding place after secretly observing a remote alley that also extended in all directions. She walked towards the golden-masked man. The man was still wearing his black tuxedo. His light brown eyes swept over Zio's head. "There's a mission for you. Difficulty and compensation?" Zio asked like clockwork. The man nudged his mask, which was forged from gold. "It's not dangerous, but it can be very dangerous. It all depends on what you do. The initial compensation is £30. If you can acquire useful information, I can even directly give you a Beyonder ingredient corresponding to sheriff." "What's the mission?" Zio said with a frown. The golden-masked man's gaze turned heavy as he said, "Through the channels available to you, figure out who has recently been keeping tabs on Capim." "Capim? That human trafficker?" Zio returned with a question. The man nodded. "Yes. I reject this mission. I hate him." Zio immediately refused. The man opposite her chuckled. "You aren't working for Capim. Because he's dead." "Dead?" Zio was instantly stunned. He died at home, and his body was covered with tarot cards. There were 2 cards on his face, one, Judgment, and the other, the Emperor. By the way, pay attention to matters in the past few years which have involved tarot cards but were not reported to the police, the man added. Chapter 382, Hero Bandit Sherwood Borough, in the house Zio and Furs rented. Furs was just finishing the beginning of her new book and, in her good mood, prepared to reward herself with a cigarette, when Zio pushed open the door and entered the study. "Smoking is harmful to your health." Zio sniffed. Furs didn't argue with her when she saw her puzzled look. Instead, she asked, "Looks like something happened to you?" Zio scratched her rough blonde hair and sat down on a nearby chair. That person from before contacted me, the person who sold the sheriff formula to me through another person at Mr. A's gathering. He gave me a relatively simple mission. The initial reward is 30 pounds. I don't even know if there are any hidden dangers. Furs thought for a moment and then said, that person? There should be an organization behind him, but why would they want to rope you in? Aren't they afraid of being implicated by your intelligence, thus causing the entire organization to be completely destroyed? There's nothing they really need from you either. Your looks are barely passable, but you're too short, so perhaps your life is relatively more valuable. And what mission is it? Zio was used to her good friend's snide remarks as she ignored what she said in the beginning. She directly answered the second question, investigate if there has been anyone keeping tabs on Capim recently. Capim? The human trafficker who deserves to be hanged? No, burned to death? Although Furs wasn't a bounty hunter, it was her writer's instinct to gather material, so she often asked Zio to tell her stories and news she had learned. Zio nodded. It's him, but he's already dead. He seems to have died rather miserably. How did he die? Was he sliced to death by a knife, bit by bit? Furs asked, pleased and curious. That person didn't go into a detailed description. Perhaps it'll be mentioned in the papers tomorrow. Zio thought for 2 seconds before continuing. He only mentioned a rather special situation at the scene of the death. He said that Capim's corpse was covered in tarot cards. His face was covered with the Judgment and the Emperor cards. The Judgment card probably meant that it was a judgment on Capim and the verdict was death. But what does the Emperor card represent? That murder? No, that hero's identity? As a best-selling author, Furs instinctively began interpreting the unique layout of the scene of the crime. Suddenly, she froze. Tarot cards? The corpse was strewn with tarot cards? Furs suddenly thought of the secret organization she had just joined, Tarot Club. It couldn't be one of us, could it? However, none of the members has the code name of the Emperor. If it's really the case, then this is the first time I've found traces of the Tarot Club in the real world. We're not just a secret organization that only exists above the gray fog. As Furs's emotions churned, she felt pleasantly surprised and also worried. Under an attendance lead, Klein entered the familiar activity room. There was only one candle in the room. The dim yellow light made the surroundings look like a scene from a ghost story. Coupled with the black robes and the iron masks worn by the mysterious people, the atmosphere turned even more intense. The moment he stepped in, Klein suddenly had a baffling sensation. He felt the flickering candle flames staring at him. He felt that the flame would burst and ignite his hair and robe. He felt that the curtain behind the oriel window would suddenly flare up, enveloping his body, and covering his nose and mouth, forcefully choking him to death. What's happening? Klein was stunned as he turned extremely tense. It wasn't a premonition for danger, but a feeling that was hard to avoid. Klein carefully found a seat and sat down. The moment his buttocks touched the surface of the chair, he felt as if the chair would explode and thick wooden thorns would end up piercing through his body. This reminded him of the videos he had seen back on Earth. Due to the explosion of a low-quality gas cylinder under a swivel chair, the steel pole and the debris had stabbed into the seated owner's buttocks, drilling into his abdomen. The whole scene was filled with badly mutilated blood and flesh, a ghastly sight. Why am I always making such bad associations? Is it because of the damage done to my spirit body from the battle earlier? Klein looked around thoughtfully and saw that the fat apothecary had still not attended. What happened? Or has he already left Backland? Klein murmured something to himself and heard Eye of Wisdom announce the beginning of the gathering. In the course of the next few hours, Klein felt as if the chandelier on the ceiling was going to fall sideways and smash into his head. He thought that the coffee table in front of Eye of Wisdom would suddenly move sideways and stumble him over, and he suspected that the members of the gathering around him were full of malice and might cause him trouble at any moment. It made him fidgety, alert, and puzzled, and he was too distracted to pay attention to deals that either ended in success or failure. If one is to say that a premonition for danger is like an occasional vibration, reminding one that there's news entering the room or an incoming phone call, then the feeling I have at this moment is akin to an electric drill boring constantly, causing me to be unable to relax or pay attention to anything else. Klein tried to rub his forehead, but it only touched the cold iron mask. At this moment, he felt as if his iron mask would suddenly cave in and stick close to his face, embedding itself into his brain. Is it really because my spirit body was damaged so it's making me hallucinate? Klein frowned. He originally wanted to make a request to buy the thousand-faced hunter's blood and mutated pituitary gland at this meeting, but in such a situation he could only give up out of caution. Although the level of Eye of Wisdom's gathering wasn't high, and there was a high probability that it wouldn't involve a high-level monster like the thousand-faced hunter, Klein believed that a lot of the members here also attended other gatherings and might be able to come into contact with the relevant information and clues. Amidst his anxiety, Klein attended the gathering as a bystander. Just after taking off his robe, removing his mask, and leaving the room, the feeling that everything in the room was going to harm him had instantly disappeared, disappearing in the oddest manner. Klein's pupils shrank, confirming that his previous experiences didn't originate from the damage to his spirit body. Otherwise, he wouldn't have experienced two completely different states, inside and outside. He suspected that there was a person or creature in the activity room of the gathering, one that was invisible, imperceptible, and extremely terrifying. That entity had stimulated his spiritual perception as a seer and his sense of danger as a clown, but because of the entity's suppression or some other special reason, this stimulus appeared in the form of a rich association that failed to make him realize it. Who could it be? This is too scary. Just the existence itself made me have a reaction similar to the symptoms of losing control. Without making a sound, Klein left Eye of Wisdom's house and headed toward the nearest street. All of a sudden, he had a guess. The Bravehearts bar is nearby, and it's also the monitoring area of Wraith Steve, who was killed by Miss Sharon, Merrick, and I. Their deaths would definitely make the Rose School of Thought's high-sequence Beyonder angry, and he would cast his sights over here, towards the Beyonders living near the Bravehearts bar. Was that him? Fortunately, I used the biological poison bottle and the sun brooch tonight, and to prevent myself from being divined, I left them above the gray fog. Otherwise, the result would be unimaginable. The magician who just completed an impossible performance would be killed directly here. The Beyonder world is truly dangerous. Inside the Holy Wind Cathedral, Cardinal Ace Snake looked at the captain of the mandated Punisher team and asked emotionlessly, "Who is Capim? Why is there an underground dungeon in his villa?" The captain of the mandated Punisher team replied immediately, "He's a tycoon, one who was rumored to be related to many cases of missing girls. He's suspected of being a human trafficker and that he is secretly engaged in the slave trade. That underground dungeon proves the rumors. Why did a human trafficker receive the protection of so many Beyonders? And their sequences aren't low either," Cardinal Snake pressed. "Your Grace, this requires an investigation. We tried using Beyonder means to find clues, but all of them failed," the captain of the mandated Punisher team replied, somewhat trembling in fear. "I've tried it too," Cardinal Snake didn't blame him. This member of the Church of the Lord of Storms upper echelon paused for a moment before continuing. "Continue to investigate this matter. Also, find that sequence 6 or 5 specter." After his subordinate had left, Cardinal Snake picked up his fountain pen and wrote down in his notebook a number of subjects to pay close attention to: Capim, human trafficking, tarot card ritual, strange specter without a high sequence, concealed plot. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall. Audrey was waiting for the maid to cut up the food when she heard her father, Count Hall, who was used to reading the newspapers at breakfast, laugh. "Capim is dead." "Who is he?" Audrey asked with her eyes wide open. In fact, she wasn't the least bit curious about who Capim was. She was simply going along with her father, who obviously had the desire to share his thoughts. This was both her specialty as a daughter and the innate nature of a telepathist. He's a tycoon who secretly might be a human trafficker. He has rather good ties with some people. Heh, Count Hall chuckled. He was killed last night. There were obvious signs of him being judged at the scene of the crime, so the newspapers are calling the murderer a hero bandit. The hero bandit Dark Emperor. Oh, they named him after the code name of the rulers of the ancient Solomon Empire. Hero bandit? Hero bandit Dark Emperor? Dark Emperor? Audrey immediately thought of the card of blasphemy belonging to Mr. Fool. This was the item of the highest level she had come into contact with so far. She suddenly became interested in the Capim murder. It sounds interesting. Although it's illegal, I still want to say that the hero bandit did beautifully. Oh, Dad, how did it go? The police and relevant departments of the church didn't divulge any exact details. I haven't met them either, but this is what's said on the papers. The hero bandit was dressed in black armor and a black crown. He had a cape of the same color behind him. After he entered Capim's villa, not only did he steal all the valuables in the safe, but he even stole the lives of Capim and his evil henchmen, rescuing girls who were locked up in the underground dungeon. He scattered tarot cards on Capim's body, and the most prominent of all were the two cards that covered his face. One of them was Judgment, and the other was the Emperor. Count Hall held the newspaper as he described it with a smile. Tarot cards, Judgment card and the Emperor card? Audrey's eyes suddenly lit up. Chapter 383. Returning home, Audrey could almost be certain that it had been done by Mr. Fool's adorer when she heard the description of the familiar scene. She suddenly felt a strong sense of immersion, participation, and pride. That was a human trafficker whose hands were stained with blood and evil. The Judgment card is the retribution enacted against him in the name of justice. Was the verdict hanging, beheading, or burning at the stake? The Emperor should be a symbol of his identity. Was this the adorer who sneaked into the Royal Museum and stole the Dark Emperor card? Audrey let her imagination run wild for a moment. She had intended to press for more information and finer details, but from the look on her father's face, the tone of his voice, and the color of his emotions, she could tell that he still didn't know what was going on. Therefore, she could only suppress her curiosity and planned on asking her good friend, Kens Learson, from MI9. Although directly asking Kans about it would suit my image in this aspect, that would still be rather abrupt. It would also conflict with my identity as a noble. I'll get Annie to prepare a few invitations for an afternoon tea party, sending them separately to Glaint, Kans, Murray, Christine, Jane, and the others. Most of them are interested in mysticism, so they would feel interested in someone known as the hero bandit Dark Emperor. Under my guidance, they can help me ask a lot of questions that wouldn't be convenient for me to ask. It's decided. Audrey retracted her attention and nibbled at her breakfast. She believed that Mr. Fool's adorers wouldn't have dealt with Capim purely for the sake of punishing evil since it wasn't in line with his identity and status. Of course, if Audrey was still the same Audrey who had just joined the Tarot Club a few months ago, then she definitely would have been willing to accept such an explanation. Otherwise, she wouldn't have chosen the Justice card as her symbol. After experiencing so many gatherings and so many matters, she felt that she had matured a lot and was no longer as innocent. She believed that there had to be more important and essential factors behind this matter, such as an evil god or secret organization which Capim was involved in. I hope Kans can provide some useful information, Audrey thought with anticipation. 15 Minsk Street. Klein was eating white bread with jam and flipping through today's newspapers. What? A safe? As he read, he almost choked on his own saliva. It wasn't me. I didn't. Don't spout nonsense. In his mind, Klein immediately rejected the description of his theft of everything in the safe thrice. The situation had been pressing, and in order to gain clues, all he did was burrow into the safe to see if there were any important documents or evidence despite having found the safe. He didn't take anything, and he quickly left the safe and went to another room. Of course, Klein, in his spirit-body state, had also suffered some damage from the gas explosion, and the total weight of the items he could carry had been greatly reduced. There were only gold bars, jewelry, land deeds, house deeds, antiques, and other items in the safe, which were either not convenient for him to take, or there was no way he could launder them. Perhaps he has a place reserved especially for cash, but unfortunately I didn't find it, nor did I have the time to look for it. Klein muttered silently to himself, confirming that it was the subsequent investigators who had divided up all the contents in the safe. He looked at the newspaper, took a sip of Side black tea, and slowly exhaled. He smiled inwardly. Hero Bandit Dark Emperor. I like that name. After breakfast, Klein put on his thick double-breasted frock coat and half-top hat, and he held a solid black cane. Opening the door, he left Minsk Street for Broken Axe Lane on the boundary of the East Borough. That was where Daisy had disappeared. After finalizing his plans yesterday, and before he committed to his operation, he had deliberately made a trip to Broken Axe Lane to seriously look for clues. He knocked on the doors of the nearby houses and asked if they had seen any girls like Daisy. Although Klein didn't believe that the official Beyonders would think that a poor family would be able to afford a hero bandit who had at least the strength of a Sequence 6, and he believed that there was a higher probability that the investigation would be directed towards the secrets Capum was involved in, supplemented by who had been keeping tabs on Capum recently, and other peripheral investigations. He still cautiously decided to put on a show and try his best to play out the entire. What if one of the Beyonder enforcers lost their mind and planned to make a preliminary investigation in this aspect? Some families might have some savings and would be able to hire other detectives. The chances of being suspected as a kind-hearted person like me who just took on the case yesterday are extremely low. As long as I'm not suspected, they wouldn't compare my performance from the previous Lenivas case. Besides, the Nighthawks were the ones who took action previously and were assisted by the military's special department. Capum's case happened in Sherwood Borough, so the ones taking on the case would likely be the mandated punishers. The communication between the two groups wouldn't be that smooth. Katie and Parker belong to the Arbiter pathway. I wonder if the military will intervene. As a former Nighthawk, Klein had a sufficient understanding of the modus operandi of the various official organizations, their work styles, and their investigation habits. Simply put, I have excellent anti-detective abilities. Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh as he boarded a carriage. He was going to continue his investigation into Daisy's disappearance. After all, he was an ordinary private detective who hadn't been able to confirm that Daisy's disappearance had anything to do with Capum. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Daisy returned to the shabby rented apartment under the escort of the police officer in charge of the neighborhood. Along with a few pitiful girls like her, she had been settled into the various cathedrals in Sherwood Borough last night and had been questioned accordingly. It included what they saw when they escaped, what they saw when they looked back, where they lived, what their family situation was, if they knew any friends who were out of the ordinary, and so on and so forth. Daisy, who was still in a state of panic and lingering fear, answered the questions truthfully. After that, no one came to her again. She slept through the night and was sent back to East Borough early in the morning, where she was handed over to the fierce police officer she always saw. Along the way, Daisy didn't dare to say anything. She trembled in fear, and only when she entered the apartment where she lived did she feel a little more at ease. As soon as she stepped through the door, and before she could find her mother and sister through the hanging wet clothes, she heard a scream. "Daisy!" Freya stopped whatever she was doing and, like a nimble fawn, darted through the clothes hanging in the air and the random things on the ground. She ran to the door and hugged her sister tightly. Then she let go of her hand, and with tears streaming down her cheeks, she sized Daisy up with pleasant surprise and in concern. "Are you all right? It's so wonderful that you're finally back." Liv also stood up from behind the wash basin. She wiped her hands on her clothes and asked, rubbing her eyes, "Daisy, where have you been these past few days?" At that moment, the police officer interrupted. "She was kidnapped. We rescued her." Thank you. You guys are too great." Liv shed tears and randomly used an adjective. The policeman coughed lightly and said, "That's our duty. Have you met anyone strange in the past few days?" Liv was stunned for a second. Hoping to not be involved in too many matters or get into any trouble, she said, "No, I really haven't." The policeman waved his hand and said, "Be more careful in the future. Don't take deserted shortcuts again." He couldn't stand the humidity and the motley of smells, so he turned and left. Liv looked at her daughter again. She took wide strides over to her side and wiped her hands on the side of her clothes before hugging Daisy. It's good that you're back. It's good that you're back, she murmured through her tears, not asking if Daisy had been hurt. Daisy relaxed and sobbed. Beside her, Freyja was also crying. She stretched out her arms and hugged her mother and sister respectively. The three of them cried for a while before letting go. Liv wiped her eyes again and said, "Wash the clothes first, there are still a lot of them." Daisy, who had just been rescued, nodded and quickly threw herself into her busy work. It wasn't until noon, while they were nibbling on their black bread and drinking plain water that could hardly even be considered tea, that Liv finally had time to ask, "Daisy, were you hurt?" Daisy shook her head. "They just hit me a few times." "That's great. The police rescued you? A kind detective was willing to help search for you for free yesterday, and you ended up returning today." He still has your vocabulary book," Freyja mentioned in passing. "Already prepared," Liv mentioned. "I'll get old Kohler to get it back and tell the detective you're home so that he won't have to busy himself over this matter. Regardless, we have to thank him again." Daisy felt relieved as she replied to her sister's question. "No, it wasn't the police. There was a sudden explosion, and the doors that kept us locked up were strangely opened, and we just ran out. However, I did see a gentleman or a lady on the roof. He wore black armor, a crown-like helmet, and a cape. He just stood there watching us quietly. None of those bad guys came to stop us or chase us down." As a tutor at the free school, Daisy clearly had a richer set of vocabulary than her mother. "Oof. A person dressed like that saved you?" Liv answered in shock. By the side, Freyja curiously waited for the answer. Daisy nodded seriously and said, "Yes, he's like what the bards sing of. A hero." Freyja ruminated over the word, her eyes as bright as the stars. In a certain secret chamber, a group of people were carefully comparing the Lenivis case with the Capum case using the information they were given as they searched for similarities between the motives and modus operandi. The two things cannot be linked together at all. The only thing that they have in common is evil, or rather, evil was defeated. "The owner of the tarot card has upheld justice," someone exclaimed. It can be confirmed that the two cases didn't involve the same person. The difference in strength is obvious, and what they're good at is even more contrasting. Although it's possible that their sequence had been elevated, Capum's murderer was a kind of specter, or someone that can switch into the sequence state. That's not something common. Another person's analysis was endorsed by the majority. Therefore, the person who called the meeting concluded, two cases, two different people, but they both threw out tarot cards. Perhaps the latter was committing a copycat crime, and if that's the case, we can target the people who are aware of the Lenivis case. The other possibility is that there is an organization. An organization symbolized by tarot cards. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.